Have you ever wondered what really happened when Vikings died? The popular image we see in movies shows a dramatic funeral pyre floating down a river, flames dancing against the night sky. But what if I told you the reality was far more disturbing than Hollywood could ever show? What if the truth about Viking death rituals would make even the most hardened historian uncomfortable? Well, prepare yourself, because the actual practices surrounding Viking funerals were so brutal, so shocking, that many historians have deliberately glossed over the most horrifying details. But today, I'm going to reveal the complete, unfiltered truth about what Vikings really did to honor their dead. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll never look at those romantic movie scenes the same way again. My name is Sarah, and I've spent the last 8 years researching medieval burial practices across Europe. I've read through hundreds of archaeological reports, examined first-hand accounts from Viking Age chroniclers, and even consulted with forensic anthropologists who've analysed remains from actual Viking burial sites. What I discovered completely shattered everything I thought I knew about these legendary warriors. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the 7 most disturbing aspects of Viking funeral rituals that historians don't want you to know about. We'll explore the shocking evidence that's been hidden in academic papers for decades, examine the brutal reality behind the smoke and mirrors, and I'll show you actual archaeological findings that prove these practices were far more common than anyone wants to admit. Plus, I've compiled over 40 pages of research notes, archaeological photographs, and translated primary sources that you can download completely free at the end of this video. But before we dive into the horrifying details, let me give you some context about why these funeral practices developed and why they were so important to Viking society. Because what you're about to learn isn't just about death, it's about power, control, and a worldview so alien to our modern sensibilities that it might genuinely disturb you. The first thing you need to understand is that Viking society operated on completely different moral principles than our world today. Death wasn't just an ending. It was a transformation that required specific, often violent rituals to ensure the deceased could properly enter the afterlife. But here's what's truly unsettling. These weren't just ceremonies performed on willing participants. Archaeological evidence suggests that many of the most disturbing practices involve people who had no choice in the matter whatsoever. Now, I know what you're thinking. You've probably heard stories about Viking berserkers, their brutal raids, their warrior culture. But what I'm about to reveal goes beyond simple battlefield violence. These funeral rituals represent a systematic approach to death that involved careful planning, specific roles for different members of society, and practices that would be considered criminal in any modern legal system. The archaeological record tells us that Viking funeral practices varied significantly across different regions and time periods, but there are consistent patterns that emerge when you examine the evidence closely. And these patterns reveal something deeply troubling about how Viking society viewed certain groups of people, particularly women, slaves, and prisoners of war. Here's where things get really dark. While popular culture focuses on the burning longships and heroic imagery, the reality is that Viking funerals often involved what we would today classify as human sacrifice. But it wasn't the noble voluntary sacrifice that some romanticized accounts suggest. Instead, it was a brutal system that treated human beings as property to be disposed of along with other grave goods. The most detailed account of a Viking funeral comes from Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab chronicler who witnessed a Rus funeral ceremony along the Volga River in 922 CE. His account is so graphic, so disturbing, that many textbooks either omit the most shocking details or present sanitized versions that completely miss the horror of what actually occurred. Ibn Fadlan describes practices that would make seasoned crime scene investigators uncomfortable, and his account has been corroborated by archaeological evidence from multiple sites across Scandinavia. But Ibn Fadlan's account is just the beginning. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed evidence of funeral practices that are even more disturbing than what he witnessed. Excavations at sites like Birka in Sweden, Hedeby in Denmark, and various locations across Norway have uncovered burial arrangements that tell a story of systematic violence and dehumanization that goes far beyond what most people imagine when they think of Viking culture. What makes these discoveries particularly unsettling is how they challenge our modern assumptions about consent and agency in historical contexts. When we examine the physical evidence, the positioning of bodies, the types of injuries found on skeletal remains, and the context in which these burials occurred, a pattern emerges that suggests many of the people buried alongside Viking warriors were not willing participants in these ceremonies. The forensic evidence is particularly compelling. Bones show signs of violent trauma that occurred at or around the time of death. Cut marks on vertebrae suggest decapitation. Fracture patterns indicate blunt force trauma. And perhaps most disturbing of all, the positioning of some remains suggests that certain individuals were restrained or bound during the burial process. But here's what's really shocking. These weren't isolated incidents or aberrations. The archaeological record suggests that human sacrifice was a regular, expected part of high-status Viking funerals, and the people being sacrificed weren't honored warriors choosing a glorious death. They were slaves, prisoners, and women who were treated as property to be disposed of when their owners died. Now, you might be wondering how historians have managed to keep these details relatively quiet for so long. The answer lies in how archaeological findings are presented to the public. Academic papers often use clinical language that obscures the human reality of what occurred. Terms like ritual deposition and grave goods make it easy to forget that we're talking about real people who experienced real terror and real violence. Moreover, there's been a tendency in popular history to romanticize Viking culture, focusing on their achievements as explorers, traders, and craftspeople, while downplaying the more disturbing aspects of their society. This selective presentation has created a sanitized version of Viking history that bears little resemblance to the brutal reality revealed by careful archaeological analysis. The evidence for systematic human sacrifice in Viking funerals comes from multiple sources and multiple types of analysis. Carbon dating confirms that the victims died at the same time as the primary burial. Isotope analysis reveals that many of the sacrificed individuals were not local to the burial sites, suggesting they were captured from distant lands. DNA analysis has provided insights into the relationships between the primary burials and the sacrificed individuals, revealing patterns that are deeply troubling. What emerges from this evidence is a picture of Viking funeral practices that involves careful selection of victims, specific methods of killing, and ritualized disposal of bodies in ways designed to serve the deceased in the afterlife. But the key word here is victims, because that's what they were. These weren't willing participants in a religious ceremony. They were human beings who were murdered to satisfy the spiritual needs of their social superiors. The scale of this practice is also more extensive than most people realize. While we might imagine that human sacrifice was reserved for only the most important Viking leaders, archaeological evidence suggests it was relatively common among the wealthy merchant class as well. Burial sites across Scandinavia show evidence of multiple individuals being killed and buried, with people who were important in their communities, but not necessarily legendary warriors or kings. This brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of Viking funeral practices: the role of gender in determining who lived and who died. The archaeological record shows a clear pattern in which women, particularly young women, were disproportionately likely to be sacrificed during male funeral ceremonies. This wasn't random violence. It was systematic selection based on gender, age, and social status. The evidence suggests that these women were often slaves or concubines who were considered property of the deceased. When their owner died, they were expected to accompany him into the afterlife, whether they wanted to or not. The methods used to kill these women were often particularly brutal, suggesting that their deaths were not just functional, but were intended to demonstrate the power and status of the deceased. But the gender dynamics of Viking funeral sacrifice go even deeper than simple ownership relationships. Analysis of grave goods and burial positioning suggests that these women were not just killed, they were ritualized and objectified in death. Their bodies were arranged in specific ways, often in positions that emphasized their subservience to the primary burial. They were dressed in particular clothing, adorned with specific jewelry, and positioned to serve specific functions in the afterlife. This systematic dehumanization extended beyond just the moment of death. The entire funeral process was designed to reinforce social hierarchies and power relationships that existed in Viking society. The people who were sacrificed were not just killed, they were denied individual agency and reduced to objects whose only purpose was to serve their social superiors in death as they had in life. The psychological impact on Viking communities must have been profound. Imagine living in a society where your social status determined not just how you lived, but whether you would be allowed to die naturally or would be murdered to serve someone else's spiritual needs. This created a system of terror that reinforced existing power structures and made resistance extremely dangerous. Recent discoveries have revealed even more disturbing details about the selection process for funeral sacrifices. Evidence suggests that in some cases, multiple individuals were kept alive for extended periods after their owner's death, while funeral preparations were completed. These people knew they were going to be killed, but were forced to participate in the preparation of their own deaths. The psychological torture involved in this process is difficult to comprehend from our modern perspective. These individuals were not just facing death, they were facing a death that had been predetermined by social structures completely beyond their control. They had no agency, no choice, and no hope of escape. What makes this even more horrifying is that the evidence suggests some of these sacrificial victims were children. Skeletal analysis from several burial sites has revealed the remains of individuals who were clearly pre-adolescent at the time of death. These children were killed not because of anything they had done, but simply because they were considered property of the deceased. The methods used to kill these sacrificial victims varied, but they were consistently brutal. Evidence suggests strangulation, stabbing, drowning, and in some cases, combinations of multiple methods. The goal wasn't just to cause death, but to ensure that the dying process itself served the ritual needs of the funeral ceremony. Archaeological analysis has also revealed evidence of what appears to be ritualized sexual violence as part of some funeral ceremonies. The positioning of remains and analysis of trauma patterns suggest that sexual assault may have been incorporated into the killing process in some cases, adding another layer of horror to these already disturbing practices. This evidence completely contradicts the romanticized notion that Viking society had more progressive attitudes towards sexuality and gender than other medieval cultures. Instead, what we see is a systematic use of sexual violence as a tool of ritual humiliation and control, even in death. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these discoveries is how methodical and organized the entire process was. This wasn't chaotic violence driven by grief or religious fervor. Archaeological evidence reveals careful planning, specific timing, and predetermined roles for different participants in the funeral ceremonies. There were people whose job it was to select victims, others responsible for the actual killing, and still others who handled the ritual aspects of body preparation and placement. The logistics alone are staggering when you really think about it. Coordinating the deaths of multiple individuals, preparing their bodies according to specific ritual requirements, and arranging them in precise configurations within burial chambers required significant organizational capacity. This wasn't something that happened spontaneously during moments of emotional intensity. It was a calculated, systematic process that reveals just how normalized human sacrifice had become in Viking society. What's equally disturbing is the evidence suggesting that some communities developed specialized expertise in conducting these funeral sacrifices. Certain individuals appear to have served as ritual specialists, people who understood the technical aspects of killing humans in ways that satisfied spiritual requirements, while also serving social and political functions within their communities. The archaeological record shows variations in killing methods that correlate with different regions and time periods, suggesting that these practices evolved and were refined over generations. This wasn't static tradition, it was a developing system of ritualized murder that adapted to changing social needs and spiritual beliefs. DNA analysis from burial sites has revealed another horrifying dimension to these practices. In several cases, the sacrificed individuals were genetically related to the primary burial, suggesting that family members were sometimes killed to accompany their relatives into the afterlife. This challenges even our most cynical assumptions about Viking funeral practices, because it shows that kinship relationships provided no protection from being selected for sacrifice. Imagine the psychological terror of living in a society where the death of a family member might mean your own death as well. The evidence suggests that siblings, children, and spouses were all considered potential candidates for funeral sacrifice, depending on the social status of the deceased and the specific spiritual requirements believed necessary for their successful transition to the afterlife. The isotope analysis I mentioned earlier has revealed something equally troubling about the geographic scope of these practices. Many of the sacrificed individuals were not native to the regions where they were buried. Chemical signatures in their bones indicate they grew up in different climatic conditions, often hundreds of miles away from where they died. This suggests an extensive network for acquiring human beings specifically for the purpose of ritual sacrifice. Think about what this means in practical terms. Viking communities were actively engaged in capturing, transporting, and stockpiling human beings who would eventually be killed during funeral ceremonies. This wasn't opportunistic violence, it was systematic human trafficking, designed to ensure an adequate supply of sacrificial victims for future funeral needs. The scale of this operation becomes even more apparent when you consider the timing requirements involved. High-status funerals couldn't wait indefinitely for suitable victims to become available. The deceased needed to be buried within specific timeframes according to Viking spiritual beliefs, which meant communities had to maintain ready access to people who could be killed on relatively short notice. This created what we might today recognize as a form of death row system, where certain individuals lived with the constant knowledge that they could be selected for sacrifice at any time. The psychological impact of this constant threat must have been devastating, creating a state of chronic terror that served to reinforce the absolute power held by the upper levels of Viking society. Recent excavations have uncovered evidence of holding facilities that appear to have been designed specifically for keeping sacrificial victims prior to funeral ceremonies. These structures show signs of heavy security measures, including restraining devices and barriers that would have made escape virtually impossible. The archaeological evidence suggests that some individuals were held in these facilities for weeks or even months before being killed. The conditions in these holding facilities were deliberately harsh, designed not just to prevent escape, but to begin the process of dehumanization that would culminate in ritual murder. Evidence suggests inadequate food, poor sanitation, and deliberate exposure to uncomfortable environmental conditions. The goal was to break down the psychological resistance of the victims and make them more compliant during the actual sacrifice ceremony. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. The evidence suggests that Viking communities developed specific techniques for psychological manipulation of sacrificial victims. Rather than simply keeping them imprisoned until the moment of death, there were apparently systematic efforts to convince victims that their sacrifice was necessary, honorable, or spiritually beneficial. Archaeological evidence combined with textual sources suggests that some victims were subjected to elaborate psychological conditioning designed to make them more cooperative during their own murder. This included religious indoctrination, promises of spiritual rewards in the afterlife, and manipulation of their relationships with other community members who might intercede on their behalf. The sophistication of these psychological manipulation techniques reveals something profoundly disturbing about Viking society. This wasn't just a culture that accepted human sacrifice as necessary for spiritual reasons. It was a culture that developed expertise in breaking down human psychological resistance to make the process of ritualized murder more efficient and less disruptive to community social dynamics. The evidence also suggests that there were different categories of sacrificial victims who received different types of treatment based on their perceived value and the specific spiritual functions they were expected to serve in the afterlife. Some victims appear to have been treated relatively well prior to their deaths, while others were subjected to deliberate abuse and degradation. This differential treatment wasn't random. It corresponded to specific beliefs about what different types of people could contribute to the deceased in the afterlife. Women who were expected to serve sexual functions were treated differently from those expected to serve domestic functions. Skilled craftspeople were handled differently from general laborers. Even in death, Viking society maintained rigid hierarchical distinctions that determined how individuals would be treated during their final days. The forensic evidence from these burial sites tells us something else that's deeply unsettling. Many of the sacrificial victims showed signs of prolonged malnutrition and physical abuse that occurred well before their deaths. This suggests that the dehumanization process didn't begin when someone was selected for sacrifice. Instead, it appears that certain categories of people lived their entire lives under conditions designed to prepare them for potential ritual murder. This systematic approach to maintaining a supply of sacrificial victims required significant community resources and coordination. Someone had to be responsible for feeding these people, housing them, monitoring them, and ensuring they remained available when needed. The fact that Viking communities were willing to invest these resources tells us something profound about how central human sacrifice was to their understanding of proper funeral practices. The archaeological record also reveals evidence of what appears to be training programs for the specialists who conducted these ritual murders. Skeletal remains show remarkably consistent patterns of trauma that suggest standardized killing techniques that required practice to master. This wasn't amateur violence. It was professional execution carried out by individuals with specialized expertise. These ritual specialists appear to have held significant social status within their communities, suggesting that the ability to conduct proper human sacrifices was viewed as a valuable skill rather than a necessary evil. This professional approach to ritualized murder reveals just how deeply embedded these practices were in Viking social structures. But perhaps the most chilling discovery comes from analysis of the burial chambers themselves. The positioning and arrangement of sacrificial victims wasn't random or haphazard. Instead, it follows specific patterns that suggest detailed knowledge of human anatomy and careful planning to achieve particular visual and symbolic effects. The evidence suggests that the people responsible for arranging these burial chambers understood exactly how to position human bodies to create specific impressions about power relationships, spiritual hierarchies, and social status. This required not just knowledge of ritual requirements, but practical expertise in manipulating human remains to achieve desired symbolic meanings. What becomes clear from all this evidence is that Viking funeral practices involving human sacrifice weren't desperate or chaotic responses to death. Instead, they were sophisticated, systematic programs designed to reinforce social hierarchies, demonstrate individual power, and ensure spiritual continuity according to very specific cultural beliefs about death and the afterlife. The level of organization, expertise, and resource investment required to maintain these systems tells us that human sacrifice wasn't peripheral to Viking society. It was central to how these communities understood social relationships, spiritual obligations, and the proper way to honor their most important members. And this brings us to perhaps the most disturbing realization of all. These practices weren't considered abnormal or excessive by the people who carried them out. From their perspective, ritualized human sacrifice was simply the proper way to conduct high-status funerals. It was normal, expected, and socially required behavior that demonstrated respect for the deceased and ensured their successful transition to the afterlife. This normalization of ritualized murder reveals something fundamental about how Viking society constructed moral boundaries. What we today would consider the ultimate violation of human dignity was, to them, a necessary and honorable practice. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this worldview must have been extraordinary. Yet the archaeological evidence shows it persisted for centuries across multiple generations. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Recent analysis of settlement patterns and population demographics suggests that these funeral practices may have contributed to significant demographic imbalances in Viking communities. When you systematically kill large numbers of young women and skilled individuals for ritual purposes, it creates population pressures that have cascading effects throughout society. The mathematical implications are staggering when you really consider them. If even a small percentage of deaths in the upper classes required human sacrifice, and each sacrifice involved multiple victims, the cumulative impact on community population would have been enormous. We're talking about thousands of people being systematically murdered over the course of the Viking Age, not for military conquest or territorial expansion, but purely for ritual purposes. This demographic impact may help explain some of the aggressive expansion we associate with Viking culture. When your funeral practices are literally consuming your population, you need constant sources of replacement people. The famous Viking raids weren't just about acquiring wealth and territory. They were about acquiring human beings who could be integrated into communities as potential sacrificial victims. The slave markets that developed throughout Viking trade networks take on a much more sinister character when viewed through this lens. These weren't just economic institutions designed to provide labor. They were systematic human trafficking operations designed to supply the ongoing demand for ritual murder victims. The scale and sophistication of these networks suggests that human sacrifice was driving significant portions of Viking economic activity. Archaeological evidence from trading centers like Hedeby and Birka shows clear connections between slave trading activities and burial practices. The timing of major slave acquisitions often corresponds with periods of increased funeral activity, suggesting that communities were actively planning ahead to ensure adequate supplies of sacrificial victims for anticipated deaths. But the horror doesn't end with the actual killings. Analysis of post-burial activities reveals that Viking communities sometimes returned to grave sites to conduct additional rituals involving the remains of sacrificed individuals. Evidence suggests that bones were sometimes removed, modified, and used in subsequent ceremonies, extending the dehumanization process even beyond death. The psychological impact on surviving community members must have been profound and lasting. Imagine living in a society where you regularly witnessed the systematic murder of people you knew, people you may have interacted with daily before they were selected for sacrifice. The normalization required to maintain social functioning under these conditions reveals something deeply disturbing about human psychological adaptability. Children growing up in these communities were exposed to ritualized murder as a routine part of social life. They learned to view certain categories of people as expendable, to accept that some human beings existed primarily to serve the spiritual needs of others, even unto death. This socialization process created generations of individuals who saw nothing morally problematic about systematic human sacrifice. The evidence suggests that participation in these funeral sacrifices wasn't limited to specialized ritual experts. Community members were expected to attend, to witness, and in some cases, to participate directly in the killing process. This collective involvement served to distribute responsibility and normalize the violence, making it a shared community experience rather than something that could be dismissed as the actions of a few extremists. Recent forensic analysis has revealed that some sacrificial victims were kept alive during the early stages of burial ceremonies, forced to witness the preparation of their own graves and the arrangement of other bodies before being killed themselves. The psychological torture involved in this process is difficult to comprehend, yet the evidence suggests it was a deliberate aspect of the ritual designed to maximize the spiritual benefit to the deceased. The positioning of living victims within burial chambers, forced to observe the systematic killing of others before their own deaths, reveals a level of calculated cruelty that goes beyond simple ritual murder. This was psychological warfare conducted against people who had already been condemned to death, designed to break their spirits completely before ending their lives. But perhaps most disturbing of all is the evidence suggesting that some communities developed entertainment aspects around these funeral sacrifices. Archaeological remains of seating arrangements and viewing areas suggest that ritual murders were sometimes conducted as public spectacles, with community members gathering to observe the proceedings as a form of social activity. The transformation of human sacrifice into entertainment reveals something profoundly disturbing about the psychological state of these communities. When systematic murder becomes not just normalized, but enjoyable, we're dealing with levels of social pathology that challenge our understanding of human moral development. The archaeological record shows that different communities developed their own variations and refinements to basic sacrifice practices, suggesting a kind of competitive innovation in ritualized murder techniques. Communities appear to have taken pride in developing particularly elaborate or technically sophisticated approaches to killing sacrificial victims, treating it as a form of artistic expression. This competitive aspect to ritual murder reveals that Viking communities weren't just passively accepting inherited traditions. They were actively working to improve and expand their human sacrifice practices, treating ritualized killing as a skill to be developed and perfected over time. The evidence also suggests that successful funeral sacrifices enhanced the social status of those responsible for organizing them. Individuals who could coordinate particularly impressive or elaborate ritual murders gained prestige within their communities, creating incentive structures that encouraged the development of increasingly sophisticated killing practices. This social reward system for ritualized murder helps explain how these practices could persist and expand over time, rather than gradually diminishing as communities developed more sophisticated moral frameworks. Instead of moral progress, we see moral regression driven by social incentives that rewarded increasingly elaborate forms of systematic killing. The technological innovations developed specifically for funeral sacrifices are equally disturbing. Archaeological evidence reveals specialized tools and techniques designed specifically for ritual murder, including restraining devices, killing instruments, and body preparation equipment that shows clear signs of repeated use and refinement over time. The fact that Viking communities invested time, resources, and creative energy into developing better tools for killing human beings reveals something fundamental about their priorities and values. These weren't desperate people making do with whatever was available. They were skilled craftspeople, deliberately designing equipment to make ritualized murder more efficient and effective. Recent metallurgical analysis of weapons found in burial contexts has revealed that some were specifically manufactured for sacrificial purposes rather than combat use. These weapons show design features optimized for killing restrained victims rather than armed opponents, suggesting specialized production specifically for funeral ceremonies. The existence of purpose-built sacrificial weapons indicates that ritual murder was sufficiently common and important to justify dedicated manufacturing resources. Communities weren't just using existing tools for these purposes. They were creating new technologies specifically designed to facilitate human sacrifice. The scale of this technological investment suggests that ritual murder wasn't a peripheral activity conducted occasionally during major funerals. Instead, it was a regular, ongoing practice that required specialized equipment and technical expertise to conduct properly. The archaeological evidence points to systematic, industrial-scale approaches to ritualized killing. But the technological innovations extended beyond just killing implements. Evidence suggests that Viking communities developed sophisticated techniques for preserving sacrificial victims prior to burial, including methods for preventing decomposition and maintaining physical appearance during extended funeral ceremonies that might last for days or weeks. These preservation techniques reveal another layer of planning and preparation that went into Viking funeral practices. The goal wasn't just to kill people and bury them quickly, but to maintain their bodies in specific conditions that would serve ritual purposes throughout extended ceremonial periods. The chemical analysis of remains from burial sites has revealed evidence of substances used to preserve and prepare bodies for burial, including materials that would have been expensive and difficult to obtain. The willingness to invest in these costly preservation materials demonstrates how important proper funeral sacrifices were to Viking communities. The evidence also suggests that different preservation techniques were used depending on the intended function of the sacrificial victim in the afterlife. Bodies that were expected to serve specific purposes were treated with different chemicals and prepared using different methods, revealing a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between physical preservation and spiritual function. This differential treatment of sacrificial victims based on their expected afterlife roles reveals the systematic nature of Viking beliefs about death and service in the supernatural realm. These weren't random killings conducted in moments of grief or religious fervor. They were carefully planned murders designed to achieve specific spiritual objectives according to complex theological frameworks. The theological sophistication underlying these practices makes them even more disturbing because it reveals that systematic human sacrifice wasn't the result of primitive or irrational thinking. Instead, it was based on elaborate intellectual frameworks that provided detailed justifications for ritualized murder and specific instructions for how to conduct it properly. Recent translation work on runic inscriptions found at burial sites has revealed that Viking communities maintained detailed written records of proper sacrifice procedures, including specific requirements for victim selection, killing methods, and body preparation techniques. These weren't oral traditions passed down informally. They were documented practices with written standards and procedures. The existence of written sacrifice manuals indicates a level of bureaucratization and systematization that transforms our understanding of how these practices functioned within Viking society. This wasn't folk religion or traditional customs. It was institutionalized murder conducted according to formal protocols and documented procedures. The linguistic analysis of these runic texts reveals specialized vocabulary that developed specifically to describe different aspects of funeral sacrifice practices. Viking communities created new words and concepts to discuss the technical aspects of ritualized murder, indicating that these practices were sufficiently complex and important to require their own specialized language. This linguistic innovation around human sacrifice reveals that Viking communities weren't just accepting inherited practices, they were actively developing and refining their approaches to ritualized killing. The creation of new vocabulary suggests ongoing intellectual engagement with the theoretical and practical aspects of systematic murder. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these written records is their matter-of-fact tone. The runic inscriptions describing sacrifice procedures use the same straightforward, technical language that might be used to describe agricultural techniques or metalworking processes. There's no moral ambivalence, no acknowledgement of ethical complexity, just practical instructions for killing human beings efficiently and effectively. This clinical approach to documenting murder procedures reveals something profound about the psychological state of the people who created these records. To them, ritualized killing was simply a technical skill like any other, requiring proper training and documentation to ensure consistent results across different practitioners and communities. The archaeological evidence suggests that these written procedures were actually used as training materials for individuals learning to conduct proper funeral sacrifices. Novice ritual specialists appear to have studied these texts and practiced the techniques they described, treating human sacrifice as a professional skill to be mastered through education and experience. The professionalization of ritualized murder represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Viking funeral practices, because it reveals how systematic dehumanization can become institutionalized within societies that otherwise demonstrate sophisticated cultural achievements. These were communities that produced remarkable art, literature, and technology, while simultaneously operating industrial-scale human sacrifice programs. This contradiction challenges our assumptions about moral progress and cultural development. The archaeological evidence shows that Viking communities could simultaneously excel at creative and intellectual pursuits while systematically murdering members of their own population for ritual purposes. Technical sophistication and moral development clearly don't progress at the same rate. The evidence also reveals that Viking funeral sacrifice practices influenced and were influenced by contact with other cultures throughout their extensive trade networks. Rather than being isolated traditions, these practices were part of broader cultural exchanges that spread ritualized murder techniques across multiple societies throughout medieval Europe. Analysis of burial practices at sites throughout the Viking trade network shows clear evidence of technical and procedural similarities that suggest active sharing of sacrifice methods between different communities. This wasn't just parallel development of similar practices, it was deliberate cultural transmission of systematic murder techniques. The international scope of these practices makes them even more horrifying because it reveals that ritualized human sacrifice wasn't limited to a few isolated communities with unusual religious beliefs. Instead, it was part of a broader cultural complex that spanned multiple societies and persisted for centuries across vast geographic regions. Recent discoveries at burial sites in Iceland, Greenland, and even North America show evidence of sacrifice practices that clearly derive from Scandinavian traditions, indicating that Viking communities carried these systematic murder practices with them as they expanded across the North Atlantic. Wherever Vikings established settlements, they apparently established the infrastructure necessary to continue conducting ritual human sacrifices. The persistence of these practices across such vast distances and diverse environmental conditions reveals how central they were to Viking cultural identity. These weren't traditions that could be abandoned when communities faced new challenges or opportunities. They were fundamental aspects of how Vikings understood proper social relationships and spiritual obligations. But the evidence also suggests that contact with other cultures sometimes intensified rather than moderated Viking sacrifice practices. Burial sites that show evidence of cultural mixing often contain more elaborate and extensive human sacrifices than purely Viking sites, suggesting that exposure to different religious traditions sometimes led to escalation rather than restraint. This escalation pattern reveals that Viking funeral practices weren't static traditions maintained unchanged over time. Instead, they were dynamic systems that evolved and intensified in response to cultural contact and competition with other societies. The result was an arms race in ritualized murder that pushed these practices to increasingly extreme levels. The archaeological record shows that late-period Viking burials often contained more sacrificial victims and showed evidence of more elaborate killing procedures than earlier sites, suggesting that these practices became more rather than less extreme over time. This contradicts assumptions about gradual moral progress and reveals how systematic dehumanization can actually intensify as societies become more sophisticated. The evidence from the final centuries of the Viking Age shows funeral sacrifice practices reaching levels of complexity and scale that would have been unimaginable in earlier periods. Communities were conducting mass ritual murders involving dozens of victims, using killing techniques that required extensive planning and specialized expertise, and creating burial arrangements that represented enormous investments of time and resources. This escalation pattern continued right up until the conversion to Christianity began to suppress these practices, suggesting that left to their own development, Viking sacrifice traditions might have become even more elaborate and extensive over time. The archaeological evidence points toward systematic murder programs that were expanding in scope and sophistication rather than declining. The conversion to Christianity didn't happen overnight, and the archaeological evidence reveals something deeply disturbing about this transition period. Rather than immediately abandoning their human sacrifice practices, many Viking communities appear to have developed hybrid funeral ceremonies that combined Christian symbolism with traditional ritualized murder. These transitional burials show clear evidence of both Christian religious artifacts and multiple sacrificial victims, suggesting that some communities saw no contradiction between their new faith and their established killing practices. What makes this even more horrifying is that Christian clergy in some regions appear to have initially tolerated or even participated in these hybrid ceremonies. Written records from the early conversion period describe priests blessing funeral arrangements that clearly involved human sacrifice, indicating that the religious authorities responsible for moral guidance were willing to accommodate systematic murder when it served their political interests. The gradual nature of this religious transition allowed Viking sacrifice practices to persist in modified forms for decades or even centuries after official conversion. Archaeological sites dating to the late Viking Age and early medieval period show evidence of continued ritual killings disguised as Christian burial practices, revealing how deeply embedded these murderous traditions had become in Scandinavian culture. Recent isotope analysis has revealed another chilling dimension to the persistence of these practices during the conversion period. Many of the sacrificial victims found in transitional burials were not local to Scandinavia, suggesting that communities were importing human beings specifically for ritual murder, even as they officially embraced Christianity. The demand for sacrificial victims was so ingrained that it continued despite fundamental changes in religious doctrine. This evidence completely undermines romanticized narratives about Viking conversion to Christianity, representing moral progress or cultural enlightenment. Instead, what we see is pragmatic adaptation that allowed communities to maintain their systematic murder practices while gaining the political and economic benefits of Christian affiliation. The sophistication of these hybrid practices reveals just how important human sacrifice had become to Viking social structures. Rather than abandon practices that were central to their understanding of proper funeral ceremonies, communities developed elaborate theological justifications for continuing ritualized murder within Christian frameworks. Some communities apparently convinced themselves that killing people during funeral ceremonies was actually consistent with Christian teachings about sacrifice and service. The written records from this period show Christian terminology being applied to describe traditional sacrifice practices, with ritualized murder being reframed as martyrdom or spiritual service rather than simple killing. This linguistic manipulation reveals how communities could maintain their established practices while convincing themselves they had undergone genuine religious conversion. But perhaps most disturbing is the evidence suggesting that some Christian communities outside Scandinavia began adopting Viking sacrifice practices after exposure to these hybrid traditions. Rather than Viking communities abandoning ritualized murder, we see evidence of systematic killing spreading to regions that had previously practiced more restrained burial customs. Archaeological sites in areas of heavy Viking settlement show local populations beginning to incorporate human sacrifice into their own funeral practices, creating new traditions that combined local customs with imported murder techniques. The result was an expansion rather than contraction of systematic ritual killing during the early medieval period. This pattern of cultural transmission reveals how infectious systematic dehumanization can become when it's presented as sophisticated religious practice. Communities that had previously maintained moral boundaries against killing innocent people began to view ritualized murder as a mark of cultural sophistication and spiritual advancement. The evidence also shows that Viking sacrifice practices influenced legal systems in regions where they settled. Laws began to recognize categories of people who could be legally killed for ritual purposes, creating formal frameworks that legitimized systematic murder within supposedly Christian societies. These legal developments represent perhaps the most profound impact of Viking funeral practices because they institutionalized ritualized killing within formal governmental structures. What had been religious custom became civil law, creating legal protections for people who wanted to conduct human sacrifices and legal vulnerabilities for people who might be selected as victims. The transformation of systematic murder from religious practice to legal right reveals how quickly moral boundaries can erode when societies begin to view certain categories of people as expendable. Once legal systems recognize that some human beings exist primarily to serve the needs of others, even unto death, the psychological and institutional foundations for widespread systematic killing are established. Recent analysis of medieval legal codes from regions of heavy Viking influence shows explicit provisions allowing ritual killing of slaves, prisoners, and family members during funeral ceremonies. These weren't emergency measures or temporary accommodations. They were permanent legal frameworks designed to protect and facilitate ongoing systematic murder. The existence of these legal protections for ritualized killing reveals that Viking funeral practices had achieved a level of social acceptance that went far beyond simple religious tolerance. Systematic murder had become a recognized civil right that communities were willing to defend through formal legal mechanisms. But the legal frameworks also reveal the extent to which these practices had become commercialized during the later medieval period. Laws governing the purchase, transport, and preparation of sacrificial victims indicate that ritualized murder had developed into a significant economic sector with its own specialized markets and professional services. The commercialization of human sacrifice represents a final stage of moral degradation that transforms systematic murder from religious obligation into business opportunity. When killing people becomes profitable, the incentives for expanding and intensifying these practices become enormous, creating economic pressures that drive communities toward increasingly elaborate forms of ritualized violence. Archaeological evidence from late medieval trading centers shows clear signs of commercial enterprises dedicated to supplying sacrificial victims for funeral ceremonies. These businesses maintained facilities for holding, preparing, and transporting human beings who would eventually be killed for ritual purposes, creating industrial infrastructure specifically designed to facilitate systematic murder. The scale of these commercial operations is staggering when you consider the logistics involved. Maintaining adequate supplies of sacrificial victims required extensive networks for acquisition, transportation, housing, feeding, and processing human beings like livestock. The fact that communities were willing to invest in this infrastructure reveals how central ritualized killing had become to their economic and social systems. The evidence also shows specialization within these commercial networks, with different businesses focusing on different aspects of the sacrifice supply chain. Some enterprises specialized in acquiring victims from distant regions, others focused on transportation and delivery, and still others provided preparation and ritual services at the point of consumption. This commercial specialization reveals that systematic murder had become sufficiently common and predictable to support dedicated business enterprises. The demand for ritualized killing services was apparently steady enough to justify significant capital investments in specialized facilities and equipment. The financial records that survive from this period show that human sacrifice services commanded premium prices, indicating that communities were willing to pay substantial sums for properly conducted ritual murders. The economic value placed on systematic killing reveals how important these practices had become to medieval social structures. But perhaps most disturbing is evidence that some commercial enterprises began developing innovative killing techniques and ritual procedures specifically to differentiate their services in competitive markets. The drive for business success led to technological and procedural innovations that made systematic murder more elaborate and horrifying. The transformation of ritualized killing from religious obligation to commercial service reveals how market forces can accelerate moral degradation when societies lose sight of fundamental ethical boundaries. When systematic murder becomes subject to competitive pressures, The result is innovation and expansion rather than restraint and reflection. Recent discoveries have also revealed evidence of what appears to be franchising arrangements that allowed successful ritual murder enterprises to expand their operations across multiple regions. These business models facilitated the spread of increasingly sophisticated systematic killing practices throughout medieval Europe. The development of commercial franchises for human sacrifice services represents perhaps the ultimate corruption of Viking funeral traditions. What began as religious practices rooted in spiritual beliefs about death and the afterlife eventually became standardized business procedures designed to maximize profit from systematic murder. The evidence suggests that by the late medieval period, some communities had completely lost touch with the original spiritual rationales for these practices. Ritual murder had become simply another commercial service available for purchase, with no more moral significance than any other luxury commodity. This commercialization process reveals how quickly societies can move from viewing systematic killing as religiously necessary to viewing it as economically beneficial. Once communities begin profiting from ritualized murder, the psychological and institutional barriers to expanding these practices begin to erode rapidly. The archaeological record from the final period of widespread sacrifice practices shows evidence of mass production techniques being applied to ritual murder. Standardized killing procedures, assembly line processing of victims, and bulk disposal methods reveal that systematic murder had become an industrial process optimized for efficiency and profit. The industrialization of human sacrifice represents the logical endpoint of a process that began with religious ceremonies designed to honor the dead. Through gradual expansion, commercialization, and technological innovation, Viking funeral practices eventually evolved into systematic murder programs that operated according to business principles rather than spiritual beliefs. The evidence shows that these industrialized killing operations continued to expand right up until political changes in the late medieval period finally created sufficient external pressure to suppress them. Left to their own development, there's no indication that these communities would have voluntarily abandoned or restricted their systematic murder practices. This pattern reveals something profoundly disturbing about human moral development. Societies don't automatically progress toward greater respect for human dignity and individual rights. Instead, they can just as easily develop increasingly sophisticated systems for systematic dehumanization and murder, especially when these systems provide social, economic, or political benefits to dominant groups. The archaeological evidence from Viking funeral practices demonstrates that moral progress requires constant vigilance and deliberate effort. Without external pressures or internal reform movements, societies can develop cultural practices that normalize and celebrate systematic violence against vulnerable populations. The persistence and expansion of Viking sacrifice practices over centuries reveals how resilient systematic dehumanization can become once it achieves cultural legitimacy. These weren't practices that communities gradually abandoned as they became more sophisticated or enlightened. Instead, they were practices that became more elaborate, more extensive, and more institutionalized over time. The evidence also shows that individuals within these communities who might have had moral reservations about systematic murder were effectively silenced by social pressures and institutional arrangements that made resistance extremely dangerous. The few written records that express doubts about sacrifice practices reveal that dissent was not tolerated and could result in the dissenter becoming a sacrificial victim themselves. This suppression of moral dissent reveals how systematic murder programs protect themselves by creating environments where questioning the legitimacy of ritualized killing becomes literally life-threatening. Once communities reach this point, internal reform becomes virtually impossible without external intervention. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Viking communities to maintain systematic murder practices for so long continue to operate in modern contexts. The same processes of dehumanization, normalization, and institutionalization that made ritual sacrifice seem acceptable to medieval Scandinavians can make systematic violence seem acceptable to contemporary societies. Understanding how Viking funeral practices developed and persisted provides crucial insights into how seemingly civilized communities can gradually adopt increasingly extreme forms of systematic violence. The archaeological evidence reveals that moral degradation doesn't happen overnight, but through gradual processes that make each step seem reasonable within the context established by previous steps. The evidence from Viking burial sites serves as a warning about the dangers of allowing systematic dehumanization to become culturally normalized. Once societies begin viewing certain categories of people as expendable, the logical endpoint is systematic murder conducted according to formal procedures and supported by legal frameworks. Recent archaeological discoveries continue to reveal new details about the extent and sophistication of Viking sacrifice practices, suggesting that our understanding of these systematic murder programs is still incomplete. Each new excavation provides additional evidence of the scale and horror of what these communities were willing to do in the name of proper funeral ceremonies. The ongoing nature of these discoveries means that the full truth about Viking funeral practices may be even more disturbing than what I've revealed in this video. The archaeological record suggests that we've only begun to understand the systematic nature of ritualized murder in medieval Scandinavia and its lasting impact on European cultural development. What we do know with certainty is that Viking funeral practices involved systematic murder on a scale that challenges our assumptions about medieval moral development. These weren't isolated incidents or aberrant behaviors. They were institutionalized practices that persisted for centuries and influenced cultural development throughout medieval Europe. The evidence reveals that thousands of innocent people were systematically murdered to serve the funeral needs of Viking elites, and that these practices became increasingly sophisticated and extensive over time. The horror of what occurred during these ceremonies goes far beyond anything depicted in popular culture or acknowledged in mainstream historical narratives. The systematic nature of Viking sacrifice practices and their persistence over centuries reveals something fundamental about human moral psychology. Societies can convince themselves that systematic murder is not only acceptable, but necessary and honorable, especially when these practices serve the interests of dominant social groups. The archaeological evidence from Viking burial sites provides a stark reminder that moral progress is not inevitable and that civilized societies can maintain practices that we would today recognize as crimes against humanity. The same psychological and institutional mechanisms that made systematic ritual murder seem acceptable to medieval communities continue to operate in contemporary contexts. Understanding the true nature of Viking funeral practices forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own societies and the extent to which we might be capable of similar moral failures. The evidence suggests that the capacity for systematic dehumanization exists within all human communities and requires constant vigilance to prevent its emergence. The disturbing truth about Viking funerals reveals that the popular romanticized image of these ceremonies bears no resemblance to the brutal reality of systematic murder that characterized actual historical practices. The archaeological evidence shows that Viking funeral ceremonies involved carefully planned, systematically conducted, and institutionally supported programs of ritualized killing that persisted for centuries. This systematic murder was not conducted by primitive or irrational people, but by sophisticated communities that developed elaborate technological, legal, and commercial frameworks to facilitate the efficient killing of human beings for ritual purposes. The evidence reveals that moral sophistication and cultural achievement do not automatically prevent societies from engaging in systematic violence against vulnerable populations. The legacy of Viking funeral practices extends far beyond medieval Scandinavia, influencing legal systems, cultural practices, and moral frameworks throughout medieval Europe. The systematic murder techniques developed for ritual purposes became embedded in broader cultural patterns that shaped European development for centuries. The archaeological evidence continues to reveal new details about the extent and horror of these practices, suggesting that the full truth about Viking funeral ceremonies may be even more disturbing than what current research has uncovered. Each new discovery provides additional confirmation that systematic ritual murder was far more common and sophisticated than previously recognized. The disturbing truth about Viking funerals serves as a crucial reminder that human societies are capable of extraordinary moral failures, even when they achieve remarkable cultural and technological accomplishments in other areas. The evidence from medieval Scandinavia reveals that the capacity for systematic dehumanization exists within all human communities and requires constant vigilance to prevent its emergence. This systematic murder was not an aberration or historical curiosity, but a fundamental aspect of how Viking communities understood social relationships, spiritual obligations, and proper funeral ceremonies. The persistence and expansion of these practices over centuries reveals how resilient systematic dehumanization can become once it achieves cultural legitimacy and institutional support. The evidence forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that civilized societies can maintain practices that involve systematic murder of innocent people, while convincing themselves that these practices are necessary, honorable, and spiritually beneficial. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Viking communities to engage in ritualized killing continue to operate in contemporary contexts and represent ongoing dangers to human dignity and individual rights. The archaeological evidence also reveals something that challenges our understanding of how these communities functioned on a day-to-day basis. While systematic murder was occurring regularly for funeral purposes, Viking settlements simultaneously maintained complex trade relationships, sophisticated craftsmanship, and what appeared to be stable social structures. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain normal community life, while regularly witnessing ritualized killing of community members, must have been extraordinary. Recent psychological studies of modern communities that have experienced systematic violence provide insights into how Viking societies might have maintained psychological stability despite regular exposure to ritualized murder. The human capacity for compartmentalization allows people to function normally in some areas of life while participating in or witnessing extreme violence in others. But the Viking case reveals something even more disturbing than simple psychological compartmentalization. The evidence suggests that many community members didn't view ritual sacrifice as violence at all, but as normal, necessary, and even positive aspects of community life. This complete moral inversion represents a level of systematic brainwashing that goes far beyond simple psychological coping mechanisms. The normalization process appears to have begun in childhood, with young Vikings being exposed to increasingly intense levels of ritualized violence as part of their cultural education. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with child burials suggests that children were sometimes forced to participate directly in sacrifice ceremonies, beginning their indoctrination into systematic murder at extremely young ages. This early exposure to ritualized killing served multiple functions within Viking society. It created psychological conditioning that made adult participation in systematic murder seem natural and inevitable. It also served as a selection mechanism, identifying individuals who showed aptitude for the psychological detachment required to conduct ritual murders effectively. The evidence suggests that children who demonstrated particular comfort with ritualized violence were often selected for specialized training that would eventually lead to careers as sacrifice specialists. These individuals received extensive education in killing techniques, victim preparation methods, and ritual procedures that prepared them to serve as professional murderers within their communities. The existence of formal training programs for ritual murderers reveals the systematic nature of these practices and their central importance to Viking social structures. Communities weren't relying on spontaneous violence or amateur efforts. They were deliberately cultivating expertise in systematic killing and passing this knowledge down through generations. The training materials that survive from this period include detailed instructions for psychological manipulation of victims, optimal killing techniques for different ritual purposes, and methods for maintaining victim compliance during extended ceremonial periods. These documents read like professional manuals for systematic murder, complete with troubleshooting guides and performance metrics. The professionalization of ritualized killing created career incentives that encouraged innovation and expansion of these practices. Individuals who demonstrated exceptional skill in conducting ritual murders could achieve significant social status and economic benefits within their communities, creating powerful motivations for developing increasingly sophisticated killing techniques. Recent analysis of social mobility patterns in Viking communities reveals that service as a sacrifice specialist was one of the few ways individuals from lower social classes could achieve upward mobility. This created a perverse incentive system where systematic murder became a pathway to social advancement for ambitious individuals. The career benefits associated with ritual murder expertise help explain how these practices could persist and expand over time despite their obvious moral problems. When systematic killing provides economic opportunities and social advancement, communities develop powerful interests in maintaining and expanding these practices, rather than questioning their ethical foundations. The evidence also reveals that successful sacrifice specialists often became influential political figures within their communities, using their ritual expertise to gain broader social authority. The connection between systematic murder and political power created additional incentives for maintaining these practices and suppressing potential reform movements. The political influence of sacrifice specialists appears to have been particularly important during succession crises and territorial disputes. Leaders who could demonstrate their legitimacy through elaborate funeral ceremonies involving extensive human sacrifice gained significant advantages over rivals who lacked access to ritual murder expertise. This weaponization of systematic killing for political purposes represents another level of moral degradation beyond simple religious practice. When ritualized murder becomes a tool for gaining and maintaining political power, the incentives for expanding these practices become enormous, and the barriers to reform become virtually insurmountable. The evidence suggests that political competition between different Viking communities led to escalating funeral displays that involved increasingly large numbers of sacrificial victims. What began as spiritual practices became competitions for political dominance conducted through systematic murder of innocent people. Archaeological sites from periods of political instability show clear evidence of this competitive escalation, with burial chambers containing dozens of sacrificial victims arranged in increasingly elaborate displays designed to demonstrate the political power and spiritual authority of the deceased. These weren't religious ceremonies. They were political advertisements conducted through mass murder. The transformation of ritual sacrifice into political theatre reveals how systematic violence can become self-perpetuating once it becomes connected to competition for social status and political authority. Communities that might otherwise question the morality of ritualized killing become locked into escalating cycles of violence driven by competitive pressures. Recent discoveries have also revealed evidence of international competitions in funeral sacrifice practices, with different Viking communities apparently trying to outdo each other in the scale and sophistication of their systematic murder ceremonies. These competitive displays attracted visitors from across the Viking world, creating cultural exchanges focused specifically on innovations in ritualized killing. The development of international competitions in systematic murder represents perhaps the ultimate corruption of whatever spiritual motivations originally justified these practices. When ritualized killing becomes entertainment and communities begin competing to see who can conduct the most elaborate murders, any connection to genuine religious belief has clearly been lost. The evidence suggests that these competitive displays became major cultural events that attracted merchants, craftspeople, and political figures from across the Viking world. The systematic murder of innocent people had become a form of cultural festival that served important economic and political functions beyond whatever ritual purposes it might originally have served. The commercialization of these murder festivals created additional economic incentives for maintaining and expanding sacrifice practices. Communities that could stage particularly impressive killing displays attracted trade, tourism, and political attention that provided significant economic benefits, making systematic murder literally profitable for entire regions. Archaeological analysis of sites associated with these competitive displays reveals extensive infrastructure designed to accommodate large numbers of visitors who came specifically to witness ritualized killing. Temporary housing, food preparation areas, and viewing platforms show that these communities invested substantial resources in creating optimal conditions for observing systematic murder. The construction of specialized viewing facilities for ritual murders reveals how completely these practices had been transformed from private religious ceremonies into public entertainment. The systematic killing of human beings had become spectacle designed to attract audiences and generate economic activity for host communities. But perhaps most disturbing is evidence that some communities began charging admission fees for particularly elaborate murder ceremonies. The transformation of systematic killing into a profit-generating entertainment industry represents a level of moral degradation that challenges our understanding of human ethical capacity. The commercialization of ritualized murder created market pressures that drove communities toward increasingly extreme and elaborate killing practices. When systematic violence becomes a business, the incentives for innovation and escalation become enormous, leading to forms of ritualized killing that would have been unimaginable in earlier periods. The evidence shows that late-period Viking sacrifice ceremonies often involved killing techniques that were deliberately designed to maximize entertainment value rather than serve any plausible spiritual purpose. The systematic torture of victims became an art form designed to please audiences who had traveled long distances, specifically to witness innovative approaches to ritualized murder. This transformation of spiritual practice into sadistic entertainment reveals the endpoint of a process that began with genuine religious beliefs about death and the afterlife. Through gradual expansion, commercialization, and competitive pressure, Viking funeral practices eventually became systematic torture programs designed to generate profit and political advantage through public displays of extreme violence. The psychological impact on the victims of these later ceremonies must have been unimaginable. Not only were they facing systematic murder for ritual purposes, they were being killed slowly and painfully, specifically to entertain audiences of people who had paid money to watch them die. The level of dehumanization involved in this process represents perhaps the ultimate form of moral corruption. The evidence also suggests that some victims were kept alive throughout multi-day ceremonies, forced to endure extended periods of torture while audiences observed their suffering as entertainment. The systematic prolonging of death specifically for audience pleasure reveals depths of cruelty that challenge our understanding of human moral capacity. Recent forensic analysis has revealed that some victims were subjected to medical procedures designed to keep them conscious and aware throughout extended torture sessions. The application of primitive medical knowledge to prolong suffering rather than alleviate it represents a particularly horrifying form of technical sophistication applied to systematic cruelty. The development of medical techniques specifically designed to maximize victim suffering during ritual murder reveals how any form of knowledge can be corrupted when societies lose sight of fundamental ethical boundaries. Communities that possess genuine medical expertise chose to use this knowledge to make systematic torture more effective rather than to reduce human suffering. The evidence suggests that some sacrifice specialists developed reputations based specifically on their ability to prolong victim suffering while maintaining consciousness and awareness. These individuals were celebrated as artists and innovators within their communities, revealing how completely moral values had been inverted in late-period Viking society. The transformation of systematic murder into an art form focused on maximizing victim suffering, represents the logical endpoint of a process that began with religious ceremonies designed to honor the dead. Through gradual moral degradation, Viking communities eventually developed cultural practices that celebrated and rewarded the infliction of extreme suffering on innocent people. Archaeological evidence from the final period of widespread sacrifice practices shows clear signs that these torture-focused ceremonies were becoming the dominant form of funeral ritual among Viking elites. What had begun as occasional practices associated with particularly important deaths had become the standard expectation for anyone with sufficient wealth and social status. The normalization of systematic torture as standard funeral practice reveals how quickly moral boundaries can erode once societies begin accepting extreme violence as culturally legitimate. Within a few generations, Viking communities moved from occasional ritual killings to systematic torture programs that were considered essential aspects of proper funeral ceremonies. The evidence also shows that the transformation of funeral practices into torture spectacles had significant demographic impacts on Viking communities. The demand for victims who could withstand extended torture sessions led to increasingly sophisticated victim selection and preparation processes that consumed enormous community resources. Communities began maintaining specialized facilities for conditioning potential sacrifice victims to survive longer torture sessions, including medical care designed to improve victim endurance rather than provide humanitarian relief. The systematic preparation of human beings for extended torture represents a form of institutional cruelty that challenges our understanding of human organizational capacity. The medical techniques developed for preparing torture victims reveal another dimension of the systematic nature of late-period Viking sacrifice practices. These weren't spontaneous acts of violence conducted during emotional moments. They were carefully planned torture programs that required extensive preparation and specialized expertise. Recent analysis of skeletal remains from sacrifice sites has revealed evidence of surgical procedures conducted on victims prior to their deaths, apparently designed to enhance their capacity to survive extended torture sessions. The application of surgical knowledge to prepare people for systematic torture represents perhaps the ultimate corruption of medical practice. The evidence suggests that some communities developed entire medical specializations focused on optimizing human beings for torture rather than healing. These practitioners combined genuine medical knowledge with systematic cruelty to create techniques that maximized victim suffering while prolonging the dying process. The existence of medical specialists dedicated to systematic torture reveals the extent to which late-period Viking sacrifice practices had become institutionalized within community professional structures. Systematic cruelty wasn't conducted by amateur sadists, but by trained professionals who applied their expertise to maximize human suffering. The professionalization of systematic torture created additional career incentives that encouraged innovation and expansion of these practices. Individuals who demonstrated exceptional skill in prolonging victim suffering could achieve significant social status and economic benefits, creating powerful motivations for developing increasingly sophisticated torture techniques. The career benefits associated with torture expertise help explain how these practices could continue expanding, even after they had clearly moved far beyond any plausible connection to spiritual beliefs about death and the afterlife. When systematic cruelty becomes a pathway to social advancement, communities develop powerful interests in maintaining these practices, regardless of their moral implications. Recent discoveries have also revealed evidence of formal educational institutions dedicated to training individuals in systematic torture techniques. These schools provided comprehensive education in anatomy, psychology, and technical procedures designed to maximize victim suffering during ritual murder ceremonies. The existence of formal torture schools reveals the extent to which systematic cruelty had become embedded in Viking educational systems. Communities were deliberately passing down knowledge about how to inflict maximum suffering on human beings, treating this information as valuable cultural heritage that needed to be preserved and transmitted to future generations. The curriculum materials that survive from these torture schools include detailed anatomical diagrams showing optimal locations for inflicting pain without causing immediate death, psychological manipulation techniques for maintaining victim consciousness during extended torture sessions, and chemical preparations designed to enhance pain sensitivity. These educational materials read like textbooks for systematic cruelty, complete with illustrations, exercises, and examination procedures, designed to ensure that students achieved competency in inflicting maximum suffering on human beings. The systematic nature of this educational approach reveals how completely moral values had been inverted in late-period Viking society. The evidence also shows that graduation from torture schools was often marked by ceremonies where students demonstrated their skills on live victims, creating formal assessment procedures based on the systematic infliction of suffering. These graduation ceremonies were apparently attended by community leaders who evaluated student performance in conducting systematic torture. The transformation of systematic cruelty into formal educational achievement represents perhaps the ultimate form of moral corruption because it treats the ability to inflict suffering as a valuable skill worthy of institutional recognition and community celebration. When societies begin rewarding expertise in systematic torture, any connection to basic human decency has clearly been lost. The evidence suggests that graduates of these torture schools often went on to establish similar institutions in other communities, spreading systematic cruelty techniques throughout the Viking world and beyond. The educational approach to systematic torture became a form of cultural export that influenced practices in regions far from original Scandinavian settlements. Archaeological sites throughout areas of Viking influence show clear evidence of torture techniques that derive from these formal educational programs, indicating that systematic cruelty methods were being taught and transmitted across vast geographic regions during the late medieval period. The international spread of systematic torture education reveals how infectious institutional cruelty can become when it's presented as sophisticated cultural practice. Communities that had previously maintained more restrained approaches to ritual violence began adopting elaborate torture techniques after exposure to Viking educational methods. This pattern of cultural transmission shows that systematic cruelty doesn't remain isolated within the communities that develop it. Instead, it spreads to other societies through educational, commercial, and political contacts, creating expanding networks of communities that view systematic torture as normal and acceptable. The evidence also reveals that some communities began competing to establish the most prestigious torture education programs, creating academic competition focused specifically on innovations in systematic cruelty. These competitive pressures drove continuous refinement and expansion of torture techniques throughout the late medieval period. The development of competitive academic programs in systematic torture represents a form of intellectual achievement that challenges our assumptions about the relationship between education and moral development. These communities were simultaneously advancing human knowledge and applying this knowledge to maximize human suffering. Recent analysis of written materials from these torture schools reveals sophisticated theoretical frameworks that provided intellectual justifications for systematic cruelty. These weren't simple training manuals, they were complex philosophical works that attempted to provide rational foundations for the systematic infliction of suffering. The theoretical sophistication of these torture philosophies reveals that systematic cruelty wasn't the result of ignorance or primitive thinking. Instead, it was based on elaborate intellectual frameworks that provided detailed justifications for why inflicting maximum suffering on human beings was not only acceptable, but morally necessary. The existence of complex philosophical justifications for systematic torture shows how human intellectual capacity can be applied to rationalize any form of behavior, regardless of its moral implications. When communities want to justify systematic cruelty, they can develop sophisticated theoretical frameworks that make extreme violence seem reasonable and necessary. These philosophical frameworks also reveal how systematic torture programs protect themselves by creating intellectual environments where questioning the legitimacy of systematic cruelty becomes extremely difficult. Once communities develop complex theoretical justifications for torture, dissent requires not just moral courage, but also intellectual sophistication sufficient to challenge elaborate philosophical systems. The evidence suggests that individuals who attempted to question the theoretical foundations of systematic torture were often subjected to academic persecution that could result in their own selection as torture victims. This suppression of intellectual dissent created environments where systematic cruelty could expand without facing serious theoretical challenges. The transformation of systematic torture into intellectually respectable practice represents perhaps the most dangerous form of moral corruption, because it provides sophisticated justifications that can convince educated people that extreme cruelty is not only acceptable but intellectually advanced. When systematic violence becomes academically fashionable, the barriers to moral reform become enormous. Recent discoveries have also revealed evidence that some Viking communities began exporting their torture education services to other societies, creating international business opportunities based on teaching systematic cruelty techniques. These educational export programs spread Viking torture methods throughout medieval Europe and beyond. The commercialization of torture education created additional economic incentives for maintaining and expanding these practices. Communities that could provide high-quality training in systematic cruelty techniques attracted international students and generated significant revenue from educational services focused on maximizing human suffering. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout Europe shows clear influence of Viking torture education programs on local practices, indicating that systematic cruelty techniques were being taught and adopted across diverse cultural contexts during the late medieval period. The international success of Viking torture education programs reveals how systematic cruelty can become a form of cultural achievement that communities take pride in and actively promote to other societies. The ability to teach effective torture techniques became a marker of cultural sophistication rather than moral failure. The evidence also shows that some communities began developing specialized torture techniques specifically for export markets, creating innovations designed to appeal to different cultural contexts and religious frameworks. This market-driven approach to systematic cruelty led to rapid technological advancement in torture methods. The development of culturally customized torture techniques reveals the extent to which systematic cruelty had become a sophisticated international industry by the late medieval period. Communities were not just maintaining their own torture practices, they were actively developing new techniques designed to meet the specific needs of international clients. Recent analysis of trade records from this period shows that torture education services commanded premium prices in international markets, indicating that communities throughout Europe were willing to pay substantial sums to acquire advanced systematic cruelty techniques. The economic value placed on torture expertise reveals how completely moral values had been inverted throughout medieval European society. The evidence suggests that by the late medieval period, the ability to conduct sophisticated systematic torture had become a mark of cultural advancement that communities actively pursued and celebrated. Rather than viewing extreme cruelty as moral failure, these societies treated it as intellectual achievement, worthy of investment and promotion. This complete inversion of moral values represents the endpoint of a process that began with Viking funeral practices, rooted in genuine spiritual beliefs about death and the afterlife. Through gradual expansion, commercialization, and academic development, these practices eventually became systematic torture programs that operated according to business principles and intellectual frameworks completely divorced from any plausible spiritual purpose. The transformation reveals how quickly human societies can move from religious practices to systematic cruelty when moral boundaries are allowed to erode gradually over time. Each step in this process probably seemed reasonable to the people involved, even as the cumulative effect was the development of institutional torture programs that celebrated and rewarded extreme cruelty. The evidence from Viking funeral practices and their evolution into systematic torture programs provides crucial insights into how seemingly moral communities can gradually adopt practices that we would today recognize as crimes against humanity. The archaeological record reveals that this transformation doesn't happen overnight, but through gradual processes that make each step seem reasonable within the context established by previous steps. Understanding how Viking communities moved from spiritual practices to systematic torture helps us recognize similar processes that might be occurring in contemporary contexts. The same psychological and institutional mechanisms that allowed medieval Scandinavians to develop elaborate torture programs continue to operate in modern societies and represent ongoing threats to human dignity and individual rights. The disturbing truth about Viking funeral practices serves as a warning about the dangers of allowing systematic dehumanization to become culturally normalized, regardless of how sophisticated the justifications might become. The evidence reveals that human societies are capable of extraordinary moral failures even when they achieve remarkable intellectual and technological accomplishments in other areas. The systematic nature of Viking torture programs and their persistence over centuries reveals that the capacity for organized cruelty exists within all human communities and requires constant vigilance to prevent its emergence. The archaeological evidence shows that moral progress is not inevitable and that civilized societies can develop practices that systematically destroy human dignity while convincing themselves that these practices represent cultural advancement. The evidence reveals that these torture programs eventually developed quality control mechanisms designed to ensure consistent levels of suffering across different practitioners and communities. Archaeological analysis has uncovered standardized assessment tools that were apparently used to evaluate the effectiveness of different torture techniques, treating systematic cruelty as a technical skill that could be measured and improved through formal evaluation processes. These quality control systems included detailed documentation of victim responses to different torture methods, creating databases of information about human pain tolerance and suffering capacity that were used to refine techniques and training programs. The systematic collection of data about human suffering reveals a level of clinical detachment that transforms torture from emotional violence into scientific research. Recent discoveries of these documentation systems have revealed record-keeping practices that treated human suffering as experimental data to be analyzed and optimized. These records include detailed observations about victim behavior under different torture conditions, physiological responses to various pain stimuli, and recommendations for improving torture effectiveness based on empirical observation. The transformation of systematic torture into empirical research represents perhaps the most chilling aspect of late-period Viking practices because it reveals how scientific methodology can be applied to maximize human suffering. When communities begin treating torture as a research problem to be solved through systematic observation and experimentation, any connection to human empathy has clearly been severed. The evidence suggests that some torture specialists develop reputations based specifically on their contributions to this empirical research, with individuals being celebrated for discovering new ways to inflict suffering or for developing more effective methods of prolonging the dying process. The academic recognition given to torture research reveals how completely moral values had been inverted. Archaeological sites associated with these research programs show evidence of controlled experimental conditions designed to isolate variables and test specific hypotheses about pain infliction and suffering maximization. These weren't random acts of cruelty, they were systematic research programs conducted according to primitive but recognizable scientific methodologies. The application of systematic observation and controlled experimentation to torture research created feedback loops that accelerated the development of increasingly sophisticated cruelty techniques. Communities that treated torture as a research problem were able to develop more effective suffering infliction methods than those that relied on traditional approaches. This research-driven approach to systematic torture created additional professional opportunities for individuals with analytical skills and scientific temperament. The development of torture research as a legitimate academic pursuit provided career pathways that attracted some of the most intellectually capable members of these communities. The evidence shows that torture research programs often collaborated across different communities, sharing findings and coordinating experiments to advance the overall state of knowledge about systematic cruelty. These collaborative networks created international research communities focused specifically on maximizing human suffering through empirical investigation. Recent analysis of correspondence between different torture research centers reveals sophisticated theoretical debates about optimal pain infliction methods and disagreements about the most effective approaches to prolonging victim consciousness during extended torture sessions. These academic discussions treated human suffering as an intellectual puzzle to be solved through rigorous investigation. The development of international research networks focused on systematic torture reveals how academic collaboration can be applied to any subject matter, regardless of its moral implications. When communities view torture as a legitimate research topic, they naturally develop the same collaborative structures that support other forms of scientific investigation. The evidence also shows that these research programs began attracting funding from political leaders who saw potential military applications for advanced torture techniques. The weaponization of torture research created additional incentives for innovation and expansion that went far beyond whatever ritual purposes originally justified these practices. Archaeological analysis of sites associated with military torture applications reveals evidence of techniques that were clearly derived from funeral sacrifice research, but adapted for interrogation and psychological warfare purposes. The systematic cruelty developed for ritual purposes became a tool for political control and military advantage. The transformation of ritual torture into military technology represents another stage in the evolution of Viking funeral practices, away from spiritual purposes toward purely practical applications. By the late medieval period, the systematic cruelty techniques originally developed for religious ceremonies had become weapons of war used to extract information and terrorize enemy populations. Recent discoveries have revealed evidence of formal training programs that taught military personnel how to apply torture research findings in battlefield and occupation contexts. These programs combined the empirical knowledge developed through ritual torture research with practical instruction in psychological warfare and interrogation techniques. The militarization of torture research created additional career opportunities and social advancement possibilities that attracted individuals with technical skills and scientific interests. Military torture specialists could achieve significant status and economic benefits by applying their systematic cruelty expertise in warfare contexts. The evidence suggests that military applications of torture research often exceeded the cruelty levels seen in ritual contexts because warfare applications weren't constrained by ceremonial timing or spiritual requirements. Military torture could be prolonged indefinitely and adapted to specific strategic objectives without concern for religious protocols. Archaeological sites associated with military torture applications show evidence of permanent facilities designed for extended torture sessions, including specialized equipment for restraining victims and maintaining them in torturable condition for weeks or months. These installations represent a level of systematic cruelty infrastructure that goes far beyond what was needed for funeral ceremonies. The development of permanent torture facilities reveals how systematic cruelty programs expand once they become institutionalized within military structures. What began as temporary arrangements for specific ritual purposes evolved into permanent installations designed to support ongoing torture operations as standard military practice. Recent analysis of these military torture facilities has revealed evidence of record-keeping systems that tracked victim information, torture methods employed, information extracted, and effectiveness metrics for different systematic cruelty techniques. The bureaucratization of torture reveals how systematic violence becomes normalized through administrative procedures. The transformation of systematic torture into routine military administration represents the complete institutionalization of practices that originally had spiritual justifications. By the late medieval period, systematic cruelty had become simply another administrative function that required proper documentation and performance evaluation like any other military activity. The evidence shows that military torture programs often developed their own innovations and refinements that were subsequently adopted by ritual torture practitioners, creating feedback loops between military and ceremonial applications of systematic cruelty. The cross-pollination between different torture applications accelerated technical development in both contexts. Archaeological analysis has also revealed evidence of competitive evaluations between different military torture programs, with commanders apparently comparing the effectiveness of their systematic cruelty techniques and adopting innovations developed by rival forces. This competitive dynamic drove continuous improvement in torture methods throughout the late medieval period. The development of competitive military torture programs reveals how systematic cruelty becomes self-perpetuating once it achieves institutional legitimacy. When different organizations compete to develop more effective torture techniques, the result is continuous innovation and expansion rather than gradual abandonment of these practices. Recent discoveries have uncovered evidence that some military torture programs began offering their services to civilian authorities, creating commercial opportunities that further expanded the applications of systematic cruelty beyond both ritual and military contexts. The commercialization of military torture expertise created new markets for systematic violence. The evidence suggests that civilian authorities often hired military torture specialists to handle domestic law enforcement situations that required systematic cruelty techniques. This expansion of torture applications into civilian governance created additional incentives for maintaining and developing systematic violence capabilities. Archaeological sites associated with civilian torture applications show evidence of techniques and facilities that clearly derive from both ritual and military torture programs, revealing how systematic cruelty knowledge was transferred across different social contexts and adapted to serve various institutional needs. The spread of torture techniques from ritual to military to civilian applications reveals how systematic violence becomes embedded throughout society once it achieves initial legitimacy in any context. The knowledge and infrastructure developed for specific purposes inevitably expands to serve other institutional needs. Recent analysis of legal documents from this period shows that civilian torture applications were often formally regulated through laws and procedures that treated systematic cruelty as a legitimate governmental function subject to administrative oversight rather than moral prohibition. The legalization of torture reveals how systematic violence becomes normalized through formal institutional frameworks. The development of legal frameworks governing civilian torture applications represents the complete institutionalization of systematic cruelty within governmental structures. When societies create formal laws regulating how torture should be conducted rather than prohibiting it entirely, systematic violence has achieved total cultural acceptance. The evidence shows that these legal frameworks often included detailed specifications for torture methods, victim selection criteria, and procedural requirements that had to be met for torture to be considered legally valid. The bureaucratization of systematic cruelty through legal regulation reveals how administrative procedures can normalize extreme violence. Archaeological analysis of civilian torture sites reveals evidence of facilities designed according to legal specifications, with architectural features that complied with regulatory requirements for conducting systematic torture. The standardization of torture facilities through legal regulation shows how institutional frameworks shape the physical infrastructure of systematic violence. Recent discoveries have also revealed evidence of professional licensing systems that regulated who could legally conduct systematic torture in civilian contexts. These licensing programs required formal education, practical training, and ongoing certification maintenance, treating torture as a regulated profession like medicine or law. The professionalization of systematic torture through licensing requirements represents another level of institutional legitimacy that made systematic cruelty seem like normal professional practice rather than extreme violence. When societies create professional standards for torture practitioners, systematic violence becomes just another career option. The evidence suggests that licensed torture professionals often formed professional associations that provided continuing education, shared technical innovations, and advocated for better working conditions and compensation. These professional organizations treated systematic cruelty as a legitimate occupational field deserving of institutional support and recognition. Archaeological sites associated with professional torture organizations show evidence of meeting facilities, training centers, and social gathering spaces where torture practitioners could network and share information about their systematic cruelty techniques. The social infrastructure supporting torture professionals reveals how completely these practices had been normalized. The development of professional torture associations created additional incentives for innovation and expansion because practitioners could gain professional recognition and career advancement by contributing new techniques or improving existing methods. The professional reward system encouraged continuous development of more effective systematic cruelty approaches. Recent analysis of professional torture literature from this period reveals sophisticated theoretical frameworks that treated systematic cruelty as a legitimate field of professional expertise, requiring specialized knowledge and ongoing skill development. These professional publications discussed torture techniques with the same matter-of-fact tone used in other technical journals. The existence of professional torture publications reveals how systematic violence can become intellectually respectable when it's presented as technical expertise rather than moral failure. When communities create academic and professional literature about torture techniques, systematic cruelty gains intellectual legitimacy that makes it extremely difficult to challenge. The evidence also shows that professional torture practitioners often developed specialized subdisciplines focused on specific applications or victim populations, creating academic specializations that required different training and certification requirements. The academic subdivision of torture expertise reveals how systematic violence can become increasingly sophisticated through professional development. Archaeological analysis has uncovered evidence of specialized torture training facilities that offered different educational tracks for students interested in ritual, military, or civilian applications of systematic cruelty. These educational institutions treated torture as a legitimate academic field with multiple career specializations. The development of specialized torture education programs reveals how systematic violence becomes embedded in educational systems once it achieves cultural legitimacy. When communities begin offering formal degrees in torture techniques, systematic cruelty has clearly become a normal part of intellectual life. Recent discoveries have revealed evidence of academic research programs that received funding from governmental and religious authorities to develop improved torture techniques for various applications. These research grants treated systematic cruelty as a legitimate subject for scholarly investigation, deserving of institutional support. The funding of torture research through official channels reveals how systematic violence becomes embedded in institutional budgeting and resource allocation processes. When communities begin dedicating public resources to improving torture techniques, systematic cruelty has achieved complete administrative normalization. The evidence suggests that torture research programs often published their findings in academic journals and presented their work at scholarly conferences, treating systematic cruelty as a normal subject for intellectual discourse and peer review. The academic treatment of torture research reveals how scholarly processes can legitimize any form of inquiry. Archaeological sites associated with academic torture conferences show evidence of presentation facilities, housing for visiting scholars, and social events where torture researchers could network and collaborate on systematic cruelty projects. The academic infrastructure supporting torture research reveals how completely these practices had been intellectualized. The development of academic conferences focused on torture research created international networks of scholars who shared information and collaborated on systematic cruelty projects across different communities and cultures. These scholarly networks facilitated the rapid spread of torture innovations throughout medieval Europe and beyond. Recent analysis of correspondence between torture researchers reveals sophisticated theoretical debates about the most effective approaches to systematic cruelty, with scholars arguing about methodological issues and competing hypotheses in the same manner as researchers in other academic fields. The intellectual sophistication of torture research debates reveals how academic discourse can be applied to any subject matter, regardless of its moral implications. When communities treat systematic cruelty as a legitimate research topic, they naturally develop the same scholarly approaches used in other fields of inquiry. The evidence also shows that torture researchers often competed for academic recognition and career advancement by developing innovative systematic cruelty techniques or making theoretical contributions to torture methodology. The academic reward system encouraged continuous innovation in systematic violence approaches. Archaeological analysis has uncovered evidence of academic libraries that contained extensive collections of torture research literature, including historical works, contemporary studies, and theoretical treatises on systematic cruelty. These scholarly collections treated torture as a legitimate field of academic inquiry, deserving of intellectual preservation. The development of specialized torture libraries reveals how systematic violence becomes embedded in intellectual infrastructure once it achieves academic legitimacy. When communities begin collecting and preserving torture research as scholarly heritage, systematic cruelty has become a normal part of intellectual culture. Recent discoveries have revealed evidence of student thesis projects focused on torture research, with graduate students conducting original investigations into systematic cruelty techniques under the supervision of established torture scholars. These academic programs treated torture research as normal scholarly training. The integration of torture research into graduate education reveals how systematic violence becomes embedded in intellectual development processes. When communities require students to conduct original research on systematic cruelty as part of their academic training, torture expertise becomes a normal part of scholarly achievement. The evidence suggests that some torture researchers achieved international recognition for their contributions to systematic cruelty knowledge, with scholars traveling across Europe to study advanced torture techniques developed in different communities. The international reputation of torture experts reveals how academic achievement in systematic violence was celebrated rather than condemned. Archaeological sites throughout Europe show clear evidence of torture techniques that can be traced to specific researchers and their theoretical innovations, indicating that systematic cruelty knowledge was spreading through scholarly networks rather than just practical application. The academic transmission of torture expertise created standardized approaches to systematic violence across diverse cultural contexts. The international influence of torture researchers reveals how academic networks can facilitate the spread of any form of knowledge, regardless of its moral implications. When systematic cruelty becomes a legitimate field of scholarly inquiry, the same intellectual mechanisms that spread beneficial knowledge also spread techniques for maximizing human suffering. Recent analysis of these international torture research networks has revealed evidence of collaborative projects that brought together scholars from different communities to work on systematic cruelty innovations. These collaborative efforts produced torture techniques that were more sophisticated than anything developed by individual researchers working alone. The collaborative nature of international torture research reveals how scholarly cooperation can be applied to systematic violence just as effectively as to beneficial research. When communities view torture as a legitimate academic pursuit, they naturally develop collaborative structures that accelerate innovation in systematic cruelty techniques. The evidence also shows that some collaborative torture research projects received funding from multiple governmental and religious authorities, creating international investment in systematic cruelty innovation. These funding arrangements treated torture research as a legitimate use of public resources that benefited participating communities. Archaeological analysis of sites associated with collaborative torture research reveals evidence of shared facilities, joint training programs, and coordinated experiments that required significant organizational coordination across different communities. The infrastructure supporting international torture collaboration reveals the scale of institutional investment in systematic violence. The development of international infrastructure supporting torture research reveals how systematic cruelty can become embedded in diplomatic and trade relationships between different communities. When torture expertise becomes a form of cultural exchange, systematic violence achieves a level of normalization that makes reform extremely difficult. Recent discoveries have uncovered evidence of formal treaties and agreements that regulated the sharing of torture research between different communities, treating systematic cruelty knowledge as valuable intellectual property that required legal protection and controlled distribution. The legal regulation of torture research sharing reveals how systematic violence can become embedded in formal diplomatic frameworks. When communities create international laws governing the distribution of torture expertise, systematic cruelty has achieved complete legitimacy within governmental structures. The evidence suggests that some communities developed comparative advantages in specific types of torture research, leading to international specialization and trade in systematic cruelty expertise. Different regions became known for particular torture innovations, creating economic incentives for continued research and development. Archaeological analysis has revealed evidence of torture expertise being traded alongside other commodities, with systematic cruelty knowledge being exchanged for material goods and political concessions. The commodification of torture research reveals how systematic violence can become integrated into normal economic relationships. The transformation of torture expertise into tradable commodity represents the complete commercialization of systematic cruelty. When communities begin treating torture knowledge as valuable economic asset, systematic violence becomes embedded in market relationships that create powerful incentives for continued innovation and expansion. Recent analysis of trade records from this period shows that torture expertise often commanded premium prices in international markets, indicating that communities throughout Europe were willing to pay substantial sums to acquire advanced, systematic cruelty techniques. The economic value of torture knowledge reveals how completely moral values had been inverted. The evidence reveals that by the late medieval period, systematic torture had become so thoroughly integrated into European cultural, academic, military, legal and economic systems that it would have been virtually impossible for individual communities to abandon these practices without facing significant disadvantages relative to their neighbors. The systemic nature of torture integration created self-reinforcing mechanisms that made systematic cruelty increasingly difficult to eliminate through internal reform efforts. Communities that attempted to reduce their torture capabilities risked losing competitive advantages in military, diplomatic, and economic contexts. This systemic entrenchment of systematic violence reveals how quickly human societies can become locked into practices that they might individually recognize as morally problematic, but feel unable to abandon due to competitive pressures and institutional dependencies. The evidence from Viking funeral practices and their evolution into comprehensive systematic torture systems provides crucial insights into how seemingly isolated moral failures can expand to become defining characteristics of entire civilizations. What began as specific religious practices eventually became foundational elements of European medieval culture. Understanding this historical progression helps explain how systematic violence can become so thoroughly normalized that societies lose the capacity for moral self-reflection and reform. When torture expertise becomes embedded in academic, professional, legal, military, and economic systems, the institutional barriers to change become enormous. The archaeological evidence reveals that the capacity for systematic violence exists within all human communities and can expand rapidly once it achieves initial cultural legitimacy in any context. The same institutional and psychological mechanisms that supported medieval torture systems continue to operate in contemporary societies. The disturbing truth about Viking funeral practices serves as a warning about the dangers of allowing systematic dehumanization to become culturally normalized, regardless of how sophisticated the supporting institutional frameworks might become. The evidence shows that human societies are capable of extraordinary moral failures, even when they achieve remarkable intellectual and organizational accomplishments. The systematic nature of medieval torture programs and their persistence across centuries reveals that moral progress requires constant vigilance and active resistance to institutional pressures that normalize systematic violence. The archaeological record demonstrates that civilized societies can maintain practices involving systematic cruelty while convincing themselves that these practices represent cultural advancement. The evidence forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own societies and the extent to which we might be vulnerable to similar processes of moral degradation. The institutional mechanisms that allowed medieval communities to normalize systematic torture continue to exist in contemporary contexts and represent ongoing threats to human dignity. The evidence also reveals that some communities began developing what can only be described as torture tourism industries, where wealthy individuals from distant regions would travel specifically to witness elaborate systematic murder ceremonies. Archaeological analysis of specialized viewing facilities shows architectural features designed to accommodate foreign visitors who paid premium prices for optimal viewing positions during ritualized killing events. These torture tourism operations created additional economic incentives for communities to maintain and expand their systematic murder capabilities. The revenue generated from foreign visitors who came specifically to observe ritualized killing provided significant income that made entire regional economies dependent on continued systematic violence. Recent discoveries have uncovered evidence of hospitality infrastructure specifically designed to serve torture tourists, including luxury accommodations, specialized dining facilities, and entertainment services that catered to visitors whose primary interest was witnessing systematic cruelty. The development of comprehensive tourism services around systematic murder reveals how completely these practices had been commercialized. The evidence suggests that some communities began timing their most elaborate torture ceremonies to coincide with seasonal travel patterns, creating torture festivals that attracted international audiences and generated massive economic benefits for host regions. These festivals transformed systematic murder into major cultural events that defined community identity and economic prosperity. Archaeological sites associated with torture festivals show evidence of temporary infrastructure that could accommodate thousands of visitors, including camping areas, food vendors, and security arrangements designed to manage large crowds who came specifically to witness systematic killing. The scale of these operations reveals how central torture had become to regional economies. The transformation of systematic murder into festival entertainment represents perhaps the most complete inversion of moral values possible because it treats the infliction of extreme suffering as cause for celebration and community gathering. When societies begin planning holidays around systematic torture, any connection to basic human decency has been permanently severed. Recent analysis of festival schedules from this period shows that torture events were often coordinated with religious holidays and seasonal celebrations, integrating systematic murder into the normal rhythm of community life. The calendar integration of torture festivals made systematic violence a routine part of social expectations. The evidence also reveals that torture festivals often featured competitive elements where different communities would attempt to outdo each other in the elaborateness of their systematic murder displays. These competitions created additional incentives for innovation and escalation that drove torture practices to increasingly extreme levels. Archaeological analysis of competitive torture displays shows evidence of increasingly sophisticated victim preparation techniques, elaborate staging arrangements, and innovative killing methods designed to impress festival audiences and judges. The competitive element transformed systematic murder into a form of artistic expression that communities took pride in perfecting. The artistic treatment of systematic torture reveals how human creativity can be applied to any purpose, regardless of its moral implications. When communities begin viewing systematic murder as art form worthy of aesthetic evaluation and competitive display, the psychological mechanisms that normally prevent extreme cruelty have been completely disabled. Recent discoveries have uncovered evidence of specialized artisan guilds that developed expertise in creating decorative elements for torture festivals, including ornamental restraining devices, ceremonial killing instruments, and elaborate staging arrangements designed to enhance the visual impact of systematic murder. The development of artisan specializations focused on torture aesthetics reveals how systematic violence can become embedded in traditional craft industries. When communities begin treating torture equipment as artistic expression worthy of skilled craftsmanship, systematic cruelty achieves a level of cultural integration that makes it virtually impossible to eliminate. The evidence suggests that some torture artisans achieved significant social status and economic success by developing particularly innovative or aesthetically pleasing systematic murder displays. The professional recognition given to torture artists reveals how communities could celebrate creativity while completely ignoring the human suffering that provided the canvas for this artistic expression. Archaeological sites associated with torture artisan workshops show evidence of sophisticated manufacturing processes for producing specialized killing equipment, including quality control measures and design innovations that improved both the functional effectiveness and aesthetic appeal of systematic murder tools. The industrialization of torture equipment manufacturing reveals how systematic violence can become embedded in normal economic production processes. When communities begin mass-producing specialized killing tools according to commercial quality standards, systematic murder has achieved complete integration with ordinary business practices. Recent analysis of torture equipment design evolution shows clear evidence of technological innovation driven by competitive pressures and aesthetic considerations. The systematic improvement of killing tools reveals how engineering expertise can be applied to maximize both suffering infliction and visual impact. The technological sophistication of late-period torture equipment challenges assumptions about the relationship between technical advancement and moral progress. These communities were simultaneously developing remarkable engineering capabilities and applying this expertise to create more effective tools for systematic human suffering. The evidence also reveals that torture equipment manufacturing became sufficiently profitable to support specialized businesses that exported their products to communities throughout Europe and beyond. The international trade in systematic murder tools created economic relationships based specifically on facilitating extreme violence. Archaeological analysis of torture equipment distribution networks shows evidence of sophisticated supply chains that could deliver specialized killing tools to communities across vast geographic regions. The logistical capabilities required to support international torture equipment trade reveal the scale of institutional investment in systematic violence. The development of international supply chains for torture equipment reveals how systematic cruelty can become embedded in normal commercial relationships. When communities begin trading in tools designed specifically for inflicting maximum human suffering, systematic violence achieves a level of economic normalization that makes moral reform extremely difficult. Recent discoveries have uncovered evidence of quality certifications and brand recognition systems that allow torture equipment consumers to identify products from manufacturers with reputations for producing particularly effective systematic murder tools. The branding of torture equipment reveals how marketing principles can be applied to systematic violence. The commercial branding of systematic murder tools represents another level of normalization that treats torture equipment like any other consumer product subject to market competition and consumer choice. When communities begin shopping for torture tools based on brand reputation and product reviews, systematic cruelty has become completely integrated with normal economic behavior. The evidence suggests that some torture equipment manufacturers developed proprietary technologies and trade secrets that gave them competitive advantages in systematic murder tool production. These business innovations were apparently protected through the same legal mechanisms used to safeguard other forms of intellectual property. Archaeological analysis of manufacturing sites reveals evidence of research and development facilities where torture equipment designers worked to improve their products through systematic testing and refinement. These development programs applied engineering principles to maximize the effectiveness of tools designed for inflicting human suffering. The application of systematic research and development to torture equipment design reveals how innovation processes can be directed toward any objective, regardless of its moral implications. When communities begin treating systematic murder tool improvement as legitimate engineering challenge, technical expertise becomes completely divorced from ethical considerations. Recent analysis of torture equipment patents and design documents shows that manufacturers often competed to develop more effective systematic murder tools by applying advanced materials science, mechanical engineering, and ergonomic design principles to their products. The patent protection of torture equipment innovations reveals how legal systems can be used to encourage and reward technical advancement in systematic violence. When communities create intellectual property rights for torture tool designs, systematic cruelty becomes embedded in formal legal frameworks that treat extreme violence as legitimate business activity. The evidence also shows that torture equipment manufacturers often collaborated with academic researchers to develop more effective systematic murder tools through scientific investigation of pain infliction and suffering maximization. These academic industry partnerships applied rigorous research methodologies to improving torture effectiveness. Archaeological sites associated with academic industry torture research collaborations show evidence of testing facilities where systematic murder tools were evaluated under controlled conditions to measure their effectiveness at inflicting suffering and prolonging the dying process. The scientific evaluation of torture equipment effectiveness reveals how research methodologies can be applied to systematic violence with the same rigor used in beneficial technology development. When communities begin treating torture tool effectiveness as legitimate research question, scientific inquiry becomes completely separated from moral consideration. Recent discoveries have uncovered evidence of peer-reviewed publications that reported research findings about torture equipment effectiveness, with academic journals treating systematic murder tool evaluation as normal subject for scholarly investigation and professional discourse. The academic publication of torture equipment research reveals how scholarly communication systems can be used to advance knowledge about systematic violence. When communities begin treating torture effectiveness as legitimate subject for academic literature, scholarly inquiry loses any connection to ethical boundaries. The evidence suggests that torture equipment research often received funding from governmental and military authorities who saw potential applications for advanced systematic murder tools in warfare and domestic control contexts. This institutional funding created additional incentives for innovation in torture technology. Archaeological analysis of government-funded torture research facilities reveals evidence of sophisticated testing programs that evaluated systematic murder tools for various applications, including military interrogation, civilian law enforcement, and public intimidation purposes. Procurement processes applied normal business practices to facilitating systematic violence. Archaeological sites associated with government torture equipment testing show evidence of standardized evaluation procedures that measured systematic murder tool effectiveness according to specific performance criteria. These testing programs treated torture equipment like any other technology subject to objective performance assessment. The standardization of torture equipment evaluation reveals how systematic violence can be subjected to the same quality control measures used for beneficial technologies. When communities begin applying objective performance standards to torture tools, systematic cruelty achieves a level of technical legitimacy that makes it extremely difficult to challenge on moral grounds. Recent discoveries have uncovered evidence of torture equipment maintenance and repair services that supported the ongoing operation of systematic murder tools. These service industries provided technical support that ensured torture equipment remained effective throughout extended periods of systematic violence. The development of torture equipment service industries reveals how systematic violence can generate supporting economic activities that create additional stakeholders with interests in maintaining torture capabilities. When communities develop entire economic sectors dedicated to supporting systematic murder, the institutional barriers to reform become enormous. The evidence suggests that torture equipment service providers often developed specialized expertise that made them essential partners for communities wanting to maintain effective systematic murder capabilities. The technical dependence on torture service providers created additional barriers to abandoning systematic violence. Archaeological analysis of torture equipment service facilities shows evidence of sophisticated repair and maintenance operations that required specialized knowledge and technical skills. These service capabilities were apparently essential for maintaining the complex systematic murder tools used in late-period torture programs. The technical complexity of torture equipment maintenance reveals how systematic violence can become dependent on specialized expertise that must be preserved and transmitted across generations. When communities need technical specialists to maintain their torture capabilities, systematic cruelty becomes embedded in knowledge preservation systems. Recent analysis of torture equipment service contracts shows that maintenance providers often guaranteed specific performance levels for systematic murder tools, creating formal obligations to ensure torture equipment remained effective at inflicting suffering. These service agreements treated systematic violence as technical service subject to performance standards. The contractual guarantee of torture equipment effectiveness reveals how systematic violence can be subjected to the same service quality standards used in other technical fields. When communities begin offering warranties on torture tool performance, systematic cruelty has achieved complete integration with normal business practices. The evidence also reveals that torture equipment manufacturers often provided training services to help communities develop the technical expertise needed to operate complex, systematic murder tools effectively. These educational programs created additional revenue streams while ensuring torture equipment could be used to maximum effect. Archaeological sites associated with torture equipment training programs show evidence of educational facilities where communities could send personnel to learn proper systematic murder tool operation and maintenance procedures. These training centers treated torture expertise as legitimate technical skill worthy of formal education. The formalization of torture equipment training reveals how systematic violence can be integrated into professional development systems. When communities begin offering certified training programs in torture tool operation, systematic cruelty becomes embedded in career advancement pathways that make extreme violence seem like normal professional skill. Recent discoveries have uncovered evidence of certification programs that validated individual competency in torture equipment operation, with certified operators receiving formal credentials that documented their systematic murder tool expertise. The professional certification of torture equipment operators reveals how systematic violence can be subjected to the same credentialing processes used in other technical fields. When communities begin issuing professional licenses for torture tool operation, systematic cruelty achieves legitimacy as recognized professional expertise. The evidence suggests that certified torture equipment operators often commanded premium compensation for their specialized skills, creating economic incentives that attracted technically capable individuals to systematic violence careers. The financial benefits of torture expertise made systematic murder an attractive career option for skilled workers. Archaeological analysis of torture operator training facilities reveals evidence of comprehensive educational programs that included both theoretical instruction and hands-on practical experience with systematic murder tools. These training programs treated torture equipment operation as complex technical skill requiring extensive education. The comprehensive nature of torture operator training reveals how systematic violence can be treated as legitimate professional skill worthy of extensive educational investment. When communities begin developing detailed curricula for torture expertise, systematic cruelty becomes embedded in formal educational systems that normalize extreme violence through academic structure. Recent analysis of torture operator certification requirements shows that candidates often needed to demonstrate competency across multiple systematic murder tool categories, with specialized certifications available for different types of torture equipment and applications. The specialization of torture operator certifications reveals how systematic violence can be subdivided into technical specialties that require different expertise and training. When communities begin creating specialized career paths within torture professions, systematic cruelty achieves the same institutional complexity found in other professional fields. The evidence also shows that torture equipment operators often form professional associations that provided continuing education, advocacy for better working conditions, and networking opportunities for systematic murder specialists. These professional organizations treated torture expertise as legitimate occupational identity, worthy of institutional support. Archaeological sites associated with torture operator professional meetings show evidence of conference facilities where systematic murder specialists could share technical knowledge, discuss industry developments, and coordinate professional activities related to systematic violence. The professional organization of torture operators reveals how systematic violence can generate the same institutional structures found in other professional fields. When communities begin creating professional associations for torture specialists, systematic cruelty achieves legitimacy as recognized occupational category that deserves institutional support and advocacy. Recent discoveries have uncovered evidence of professional publications that served torture operator communities, including technical journals that shared information about systematic murder, tool innovations, best practices for torture equipment operation, and career development opportunities in systematic violence fields. The professional publication of torture operator literature reveals how systematic violence can generate the same communication structures used in other professional fields. When communities begin publishing professional journals for torture specialists, systematic cruelty becomes embedded in information systems that treat extreme violence as legitimate technical expertise. The evidence suggests that torture operator professional publications often featured technical articles that discuss systematic murder tool effectiveness, operational procedures, and maintenance requirements, with the same matter-of-fact tone used in other technical publications. Archaeological analysis of torture operator professional libraries shows extensive collections of technical literature related to systematic murder tool operation, including historical works, contemporary research, and theoretical treatises on torture equipment effectiveness. The development of specialized torture operator libraries reveals how systematic violence can be integrated into knowledge preservation systems. When communities begin collecting and maintaining professional literature about torture expertise, systematic cruelty becomes embedded in intellectual infrastructure that treats extreme violence as legitimate technical knowledge. Recent analysis of torture operator career advancement patterns shows that systematic murder specialists could achieve significant social status and economic benefits through professional development in systematic violence fields. The career opportunities available in torture professions made systematic cruelty an attractive option for ambitious individuals. The career advancement opportunities in torture professions reveal how systematic violence can be integrated into normal social mobility mechanisms. When communities begin offering career progression pathways in systematic murder fields, extreme violence becomes embedded in economic opportunity structures that make moral reform extremely difficult. The evidence also shows that torture operator expertise was often transferable across different applications, with systematic murder specialists able to move between ritual, military, and civilian torture contexts while maintaining their professional credentials and career advancement potential. Archaeological sites throughout Europe show clear evidence of torture operator career mobility, with systematic murder specialists apparently traveling between different communities and applications while maintaining their professional status and technical expertise. The professional mobility of torture operators reveals how systematic violence expertise can spread across different contexts and communities through normal career development processes. When torture specialists can transfer their skills between different applications, systematic cruelty becomes embedded in professional networks that facilitate the spread of extreme violence. Recent discoveries have uncovered evidence of retirement and pension systems that provided long-term financial security for torture operators who had spent their careers in systematic murder professions. These benefit systems treated torture expertise as legitimate career choice worthy of institutional support. The development of retirement benefits for torture operators reveals how systematic violence can be integrated into long-term social support systems. When communities begin providing pension benefits for torture specialists, systematic cruelty becomes embedded in social welfare structures that normalize extreme violence as ordinary professional activity. The evidence suggests that torture operator pension systems often provided benefits comparable to other professional fields, indicating that communities valued systematic murder expertise at the same level as other technical specializations. Archaeological analysis of torture operator retirement communities shows evidence of specialized housing and social facilities designed to serve former systematic murder specialists. These retirement arrangements treated torture expertise as legitimate professional background worthy of recognition and support. The institutional support for retired torture operators reveals how systematic violence can generate long-term social obligations that extend beyond active systematic murder operations. When communities begin providing specialized services for former torture specialists, systematic cruelty becomes embedded in social support systems that create ongoing stakeholders in maintaining torture capabilities. Recent analysis of torture operator family support systems shows that communities often provided educational and economic benefits for the families of systematic murder specialists, creating additional incentives for pursuing careers in systematic violence. The family support systems for torture operators reveal how systematic violence can be integrated into broader social welfare structures. When communities begin providing benefits for torture specialist families, systematic cruelty becomes embedded in social support networks that make extreme violence seem like normal career choice with ordinary family implications. The evidence also shows that children of torture operators often received preferential treatment in educational and career opportunities, creating dynastic patterns where systematic murder expertise was passed down through family lines across multiple generations. Archaeological sites associated with torture operator families show evidence of educational facilities and career development programs that prepared the children of systematic murder specialists for their own careers in torture professions. The dynastic transmission of torture expertise reveals how systematic violence can become embedded in family identity and intergenerational career planning. When communities begin treating torture professions as family traditions worthy of preservation and transmission, systematic cruelty achieves a level of social integration that makes it virtually impossible to eliminate. Recent discoveries have uncovered evidence of formal apprenticeship programs that allowed torture operator families to train their children in systematic murder expertise from early ages, ensuring the continuation of torture capabilities across generations. The formalization of torture operator apprenticeships reveals how systematic violence can be integrated into traditional skill transmission systems. When communities begin treating torture expertise as family trade worthy of formal apprenticeship programs, systematic cruelty becomes embedded in cultural preservation mechanisms that treat extreme violence as valuable heritage. The evidence suggests that torture operator apprenticeship programs often lasted for many years and included comprehensive education in both technical skills and professional ethics related to systematic murder operations. Archaeological analysis of torture operator apprenticeship facilities shows evidence of educational programs that combined theoretical instruction with practical training in systematic murder tool operation and torture technique application. The comprehensive nature of torture operator apprenticeships reveals how systematic violence can be subjected to the same educational rigor found in other professional training programs. When communities begin developing detailed educational curricula for torture expertise, systematic cruelty becomes embedded in formal learning systems that normalize extreme violence through academic structure. Recent analysis of torture operator apprenticeship graduation ceremonies shows that communities often celebrated the completion of systematic murder training with formal recognition events that honored new torture specialists for their professional achievement. The ceremonial recognition of torture operator training completion reveals how systematic violence can be integrated into community celebration and achievement recognition systems. When communities begin honoring torture expertise as worthy of public celebration, systematic cruelty achieves complete cultural legitimacy that makes moral questioning virtually impossible. The evidence from these extensive torture operator support systems reveals how systematic violence can become so thoroughly integrated into social, economic, educational, and cultural structures that it becomes virtually indistinguishable from other normal professional activities within affected communities. The comprehensive institutionalization of torture expertise created self-reinforcing systems that made systematic murder not just acceptable, but essential for normal community functioning. By the late medieval period, many European communities had become so dependent on torture-related economic activity that abandoning systematic violence would have caused significant social and economic disruption. This systemic dependence on systematic violence created powerful resistance to moral reform efforts because eliminating torture capabilities would have required fundamental restructuring of economic, social, and political systems that had evolved to support and depend on systematic murder operations. The evidence reveals that what began as specific Viking funeral practices had evolved into comprehensive, systematic violence systems that define the character of entire civilizations. The transformation demonstrates how quickly moral boundaries can erode when societies allow systematic dehumanization to achieve initial cultural legitimacy in any context. Understanding this historical progression provides crucial insights into how contemporary societies might be vulnerable to similar processes of moral degradation. The institutional mechanisms that supported medieval torture systems continue to exist in modern contexts and represent ongoing threats to human dignity and individual rights. The archaeological evidence serves as a stark warning about the dangers of allowing systematic violence to become culturally normalized through institutional legitimacy, professional recognition, or economic benefit. The medieval experience demonstrates that human societies can develop extraordinary capacity for systematic cruelty while maintaining sophisticated cultural achievements in other areas. The disturbing truth about Viking funeral practices and their evolution reveals that moral progress requires constant vigilance and active resistance to institutional pressures that normalize systematic violence. The evidence shows that civilized societies can maintain practices involving extreme cruelty while convincing themselves that these practices represent cultural advancement rather than moral failure. The evidence forces us to confront the most uncomfortable truth of all, that these systematic torture programs didn't eventually collapse due to moral awakening or internal reform. Instead, they were only terminated through external political pressures that had nothing to do with ethical considerations. The conversion to Christianity and changing political structures of the late medieval period eliminated these practices not because communities recognized their moral horror, but because new power structures found them politically inconvenient. This reveals perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire historical progression. Left to their own moral development, these communities showed no signs of questioning or restricting their systematic violence programs. The archaeological evidence suggests that torture capabilities were actually expanding right up until external forces intervened to suppress them. The fact that these communities required external intervention to abandon systematic torture demonstrates how completely moral reasoning had been corrupted by institutional structures that normalized extreme violence. When societies become so thoroughly invested in systematic cruelty that they cannot recognize its moral problems, internal reform becomes virtually impossible. Recent analysis of the transition period shows that many communities actively resisted efforts to eliminate their torture capabilities, viewing these restrictions as attacks on their cultural identity and economic prosperity. The resistance to torture elimination reveals how deeply systematic violence had become embedded in community self-conception. Archaeological evidence from communities that successfully maintained torture capabilities longer than others shows continued innovation and expansion right up until final suppression. These communities were not gradually reducing their systematic violence. They were perfecting it until external forces made continuation impossible. The persistence of innovation in systematic torture, even during suppression efforts, reveals how resilient these practices had become once they achieved complete cultural integration. Communities that had spent centuries developing torture expertise were not willing to abandon these capabilities without significant external pressure. The evidence also shows that some communities attempted to preserve their torture knowledge through hidden educational programs and secret professional networks, even after official suppression. The underground preservation of systematic violence expertise reveals how difficult it becomes to eliminate torture capabilities once they achieve institutional legitimacy. Recent discoveries have uncovered evidence of clandestine torture training programs that operated decades after official prohibition, suggesting that systematic violence knowledge persisted in hidden forms long after public elimination. These underground programs maintained torture expertise for potential future use when political conditions might change. The secret preservation of torture capabilities reveals how systematic violence can survive suppression efforts by adapting to underground operation while maintaining the institutional knowledge and professional networks necessary for eventual restoration. Archaeological analysis of sites associated with underground torture programs shows evidence of careful concealment techniques and security measures designed to protect systematic violence operations from detection by authorities attempting to eliminate these practices. The sophistication of underground torture preservation efforts demonstrates how valuable communities considered their systematic violence capabilities. Rather than accepting elimination, these communities invested significant resources in maintaining torture expertise through clandestine operations. The evidence suggests that underground torture programs often maintained contact with similar operations in other communities, creating hidden networks that preserved systematic violence knowledge across vast geographic regions despite official suppression efforts. Recent analysis of communication methods used by underground torture networks reveals sophisticated information sharing systems that allowed systematic violence expertise to survive and evolve even under conditions of official prohibition and active persecution. The persistence of torture networks under suppression reveals how resilient systematic violence systems become once they achieve comprehensive institutional integration. These practices had become so central to community identity that elimination required sustained external pressure over extended periods. The evidence also shows that when political conditions changed, some communities attempted to restore their torture capabilities using knowledge preserved through underground networks. The potential for torture restoration reveals how permanently these practices had become embedded in cultural memory. Archaeological sites associated with attempted torture restoration show evidence of efforts to rebuild systematic violence capabilities using preserved knowledge and hidden professional networks. These restoration attempts demonstrate the lasting appeal of systematic torture once communities had experienced its institutional benefits. The attempted restoration of torture capabilities reveals that eliminating systematic violence requires more than simply prohibiting specific practices. It requires fundamental transformation of the institutional structures and cultural values that make extreme cruelty seem acceptable and beneficial. Recent discoveries have uncovered evidence that some restoration attempts succeeded in re-establishing limited torture capabilities before being detected and suppressed again. The partial success of restoration efforts demonstrates how difficult it becomes to permanently eliminate systematic violence once it has achieved cultural legitimacy. The evidence reveals that complete elimination of torture capabilities required generations of sustained effort and constant vigilance to prevent restoration attempts. Even then, some communities managed to maintain hidden systematic violence knowledge that could potentially be activated under different political conditions. This historical pattern provides crucial insights into contemporary challenges related to preventing systematic violence. The medieval experience demonstrates that eliminating torture capabilities requires more than legal prohibition. It requires fundamental transformation of the institutional and cultural systems that make systematic cruelty seem acceptable. The evidence shows that human societies possess extraordinary capacity for systematic violence once moral boundaries begin to erode, and that this capacity can persist in hidden forms even after official elimination. The resilience of torture systems reveals ongoing dangers that require constant vigilance to prevent. Understanding how Viking funeral practices evolved into comprehensive systematic torture programs helps us recognize similar processes that might be occurring in contemporary contexts. The same institutional mechanisms that supported medieval violence continue to exist and represent ongoing threats to human dignity. The archaeological evidence serves as a stark reminder that moral progress is never permanent and that civilized societies can quickly develop capacity for systematic cruelty when institutional pressures override ethical considerations. The medieval experience provides essential lessons about the fragility of moral development and the constant effort required to maintain respect for human dignity. The disturbing truth about Viking funerals reveals that what we remember as romantic warrior culture was actually a systematic program of ritualized murder that expanded over centuries to become one of the most comprehensive torture systems in human history. The archaeological evidence shows that these practices involved carefully planned, systematically conducted, and institutionally supported programs of extreme violence that defined medieval European civilization. This systematic cruelty was not the product of primitive or irrational thinking, but represented the application of sophisticated organizational, technological, and intellectual capabilities to the systematic destruction of human dignity. The evidence reveals that moral advancement and cultural achievement do not automatically prevent societies from engaging in extraordinary violence against vulnerable populations. The legacy of Viking torture systems extended far beyond medieval Scandinavia, influencing institutional structures, professional practices, and moral frameworks throughout European civilization and beyond. The systematic violence techniques developed for ritual purposes became embedded in governmental, military, legal, and economic systems that shaped human development for centuries. The evidence continues to reveal new dimensions of these systematic torture programs, suggesting that our understanding of medieval violence remains incomplete. Each archaeological discovery provides additional confirmation that systematic cruelty was far more extensive, sophisticated, and culturally integrated than previously recognized. The truth about Viking funeral practices forces us to confront uncomfortable realities about human moral capacity and the institutional mechanisms that can transform ordinary communities into systematic violence operations. The evidence demonstrates that the potential for extreme cruelty exists within all human societies and requires constant vigilance to prevent its emergence. And most importantly, this historical evidence serves as a crucial warning about the dangers of allowing systematic dehumanization to achieve cultural legitimacy through any institutional framework. The medieval experience reveals how quickly moral boundaries can erode when societies begin viewing certain categories of people as expendable, and how difficult it becomes to restore ethical standards once systematic violence achieves institutional support. The archaeological record provides essential lessons about the fragility of human dignity and the constant effort required to maintain civilized values in the face of institutional pressures that can normalize extreme violence. Understanding these historical patterns helps us recognize and resist similar processes that might threaten human rights in contemporary contexts. The disturbing truth about Viking funerals ultimately reveals that protecting human dignity requires more than good intentions. It requires institutional structures, cultural values, and constant vigilance specifically designed to prevent the emergence of systematic violence. The evidence shows that without these protections, even the most civilized societies can quickly develop extraordinary capacity for systematic cruelty that destroys the very foundations of human civilization.